Every man dreamed of becoming a martial master. They wished to practice justice and loyalty, living the life of a hero who journeyed the world. The sound created by a true master was said to be completely different from that of the average man. Everyone longed for such a life, though not all could experience it. Perhaps that was why boys fantasized about it even more. In a beautiful town, a young boy worked in a smithy, hammering away diligently. Outside, the streets bustled with activity as people passed by, while children clashed wooden swords together, laughing as they pretended to be warriors. Inside the smithy, the boy examined his finished work before approaching his client with a smile. He thanked the man for waiting and handed him the acupuncture needles he had ordered. That young boy was Tang, a 20-year-old physician. The client carefully inspected the needles, turning them in his hand for several moments. Then he grinned and asked if Mujin truly was a physician. Mujin happily confirmed that he was. Suddenly, the man declared that Mujin should become his disciple. Mujin's eyes widened in confusion as he stammered, unable to believe what he had just heard. That day, he heard the sound that would change his life forever. A few months earlier, life had been simpler. A physician's morning was usually quiet. Mujin would copy medical scrolls until the rooster crowed and finish preparing for the day's patients before breakfast was ready. It was a calm routine, repeating endlessly. At the Tang clan's clinic, his father was treating a young boy with acupuncture. With a warm smile, he warned the child that it would sting before gently puncturing his shoulder. The boy cried out, but quickly realized that it had not hurt at all. Excited, he turned to his mother and exclaimed that it had not been painful. His mother smiled in relief, while Mujin's father rewarded the boy with a small treat for enduring the procedure so well. From a distance, Mujin watched closely. He thought to himself that his father's calm silence was what had refined his skills. His father's acupuncture was as gentle as a butterfly landing on skin. Mujin wondered if he would ever reach that level of mastery. Calling out, he told his father that he was going to gather herbs, still pondering if he could one day be a physician on his father's level. He wandered through the streets of town, greeted warmly by many citizens. Mujin asked a man with an injury if he was taking his medicine, and the man cheerfully assured him that he was. A meat vendor offered him some of his goods, and others called Mujin's name in greeting as he passed. He smiled, clearly popular among the townsfolk. Without noticing, Mujin bumped into someone in the middle of the street. He looked up, confused, and muttered about what was in the road. The man he had collided with sneered in annoyance and demanded to know if Mujin was walking with his eyes closed. Trembling, Mujin quickly apologized, admitting it was his mistake. The man grinned maliciously and said that perhaps someone needed to teach him a lesson. Without hesitation, he smacked Mujin across the face. Mujin thought bitterly to himself that sometimes, despite everything, he still dreamed of being a hero. Later, in a rundown hut in the middle of the forest, Mujin's friend burst into laughter at the sight of his beaten face. Zhongguok, a 20-year-old herb gatherer, mocked him mercilessly. Pointing at him, he teased that Mujin should have asked the man to hit his other eye so that both would match in color. He continued imitating the man's voice, sarcastically repeating lines about teaching lessons and pleading for forgiveness. With a smirk, he suggested that he could give Mujin another black eye, so he could pretend to be a panda. Unable to endure it any longer, Mujin struck him in the left eye. Zhongguok cried out in pain, cursing and clutching his face. Mujin shouted that he had warned him to stop. The two scuffled for a while before collapsing, panting for breath. After a pause, Zhongguok casually asked if Mujin was hungry. Mujin admitted that he was, and his friend asked if he wanted something good. When Mujin eagerly agreed, Zhongguok pulled out a red mushroom. Mujin stared in disbelief and asked if it was just a mushroom. Standing up angrily, he accused Zhongguok of mocking him again and told him he needed to stop. Frantically, Zhongguok explained that it was actually very expensive. He claimed it was a mushroom that allowed people to experience special kinds of dreams. Mujin's curiosity grew, and he asked what kind of dreams. Zhongguok, smirking slyly, explained that last time it had let him dream of becoming a pinnacle realm martial artist. He bragged that in the dream, he had fought against over 100 martial artists from the Qingcheng sect, and the sensation had felt completely real. He added that the mushroom's poison did not harm the body. Before Zhongguok could finish, Mujin snatched the mushroom and swallowed it whole. Zhongguok's eyes widened in shock, and he shouted that he could not eat the entire thing. Mujin brushed off his concern, insisting that if a single bite allowed someone to dream of being a pinnacle realm martial artist, then eating the whole mushroom would make him the master of swords. The effects struck immediately, and he began to hallucinate, thinking that body and sword were one, that he was his sword and his sword was him. Zhongguok muttered in disbelief, noting that the effects should not have begun so quickly. With a sigh, he sat down and declared that it was Mujin's body, so he would not take responsibility if anything went wrong. Mujin also sat down, insisting confidently that as a physician, he could understand things simply by observing them. Zhongguok retorted bluntly that he clearly did not. He told Mujin to wait, as the effects would hit soon. Mujin began repeating himself with slurred words, drooling as his eyes squinted. His dream began. Butterflies flew across lava fields where scattered weapons lay. An old man stood in the center, holding a hammer upward, as he declared that embers tickled his skin like butterflies, and that the sparks from the first hammer strike were always wondrous. He introduced himself as Tang Mujin, a blacksmith who had hammered iron his entire life, though he then paused in confusion. He corrected himself, stating his name was Uyezi, the master smith unparalleled under heaven, and wondered if he had dozed off somehow. He dismissed the strange dream of being a physician as fatigue, resolved to craft the 5 master swords requested by the king of Yue, which would be the best work of his life. Holding the still molten hot sword, he declared it in the name of Uyezi. After his hard work, the gods acknowledged him, allowing him to ascend. Maidens surrounded Uyezi alongside his 5 legendary floating swords, Zhanlu, Juke, Shengxi, Yuchang, and Chunjun, swords forged by heaven and man over 20 years, worthy of all praise. As he had accomplished man's dreams and heaven's orders, the maidens poured heavenly peach wine to greet their new immortal. Amidst declarations of it being a grand day, one maiden stumbled, dropping the peach wine directly onto Uyezi's head. Mujin woke suddenly, lying in the street outside his house. A loud voice shouted nearby, accusing his father of being a fraud. The man claimed that the so-called best physician in Chengdu could not even perform acupuncture properly and swore to see him forced into retirement. Mujin's eyes widened as he came to his senses, clutching his aching head. The man stormed away in anger, while Zhongguok appeared, muttering that government officials were always assholes. Still dazed, Mujin asked what had just happened, swearing that he had only closed his eyes for a moment. Zhongguok snapped that it had been nearly a whole day. He explained that Mujin had been high on the mushroom, rambling nonsense, and that he had dragged him back to the clinic. He even mocked Mujin's ramblings about transcending through smithing and forging the 5 great swords. With a huff, he said it was a miracle they had made it back without trouble, and warned Mujin not to tell his father about the mushroom. Mujin agreed weakly, thanking him, though he wondered to himself if what he had seen had really been just a dream. He went inside and called out that he was back. His father, busy examining his acupuncture needles, barely looked up. Mujin apologized for being late and said he had gone to gather herbs, then asked about the man who had just left. But before his father could answer, a sudden surge of pain tore through Mujin's head. Memories of Uyezi's dream flooded into him. His body trembled as he clutched his skull in agony, thinking that between the waves of pain was another emotion. Frustration, though he could not understand at what. His father noticed his expression and asked if his head hurt. Mujin tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing, then asked again about the man. His father explained that he was the military attendant of the governor and had complained that the acupuncture was too painful. He said the new needles were thicker than the old ones. Mujin leaned forward, demanding to see them. His father searched for his old set, explaining that he had purchased the new ones 2 weeks earlier after the old ones had bent. Mujin's fury grew as he stared at the needles. He thought he heard something strange coming from them, a sound he had not noticed earlier that morning. His headache worsened, and he clutched his head tightly. His father grew concerned and asked what was wrong. Mujin muttered that the frustration was unbearable, admitting through clenched teeth that he was frustrated. His father guessed that it was only a cold and said he would brew medicine for him. Mujin, trembling, thought desperately that it was too noisy. Suddenly, he grabbed his father's hand and snatched the needles, glaring at them. Holding them tightly, he shouted in rage, demanding to know how the fuck these could possibly be needles. Tang Mujin stared at the bent needles in his hand, his thoughts racing. Whenever I suddenly see a shoddy item, it irritates me. Until yesterday, I could not even tell what was shoddy or not. But now, because of this strange ability, as he walked past the nearby stalls, his eyes caught sight after sight of poorly made items. A sharp pain pulsed through his head, and he groaned in frustration. Everything looks cheap and worthless. It is driving me crazy. Yet when his gaze returned to the bent needles, the throbbing eased. Still, just by looking at this, I feel refreshed. Unable to hold it in, he shouted in the middle of the street. "This is the pride of Sichuan, a needle crafted by blacksmith Seok." Then he froze, startled by his own words. But wait, how do I even know this? Besides, this new needle must have been made by blacksmith Seok as well. So why does it feel so different? I hope this is not something serious. Determined to find answers, Mujin hurried to the blacksmith shop. The moment he stepped inside, his eyes widened and his jaw fell open. Swords and blades of every shape glimmered on display, their sharp edges catching the light. He reached out and held one of the weapons, brushing the flat of the blade against his cheek. His heart pounded in awe. This is it. The instant I hold it, all my irritation disappears. Such exquisite craftsmanship. There is no way blacksmith Seok's work would change. After a few moments of silent admiration, his excitement dimmed and his brow furrowed. Wait, could it be because of that dream I had of Uyezi? Did that dream allow me to recognize a true master's work? Somehow I feel like I can even see blacksmith Seok's metalworking at a glance. Could it really be that because of that dream, I have gained insight I never had before? That makes no sense. A dream is just a dream. Learning blacksmithing through a dream, that is impossible. I must confirm this myself. I need to meet blacksmith Seok and find out what has happened to me. Resolved, he approached the counter and asked about the needle. The young blacksmith behind the forge exploded in fury. "What? You do not like this needle?" Startled, Mujin staggered back as the man continued to roar. "I may not be as good as my father, but I have been in and out of the forge for 20 years. Do not treat me like some amateur." The man was Seok Jisung, the son of the elder blacksmith Seok. Mujin steadied his shaky voice and answered, "I never said you lacked skill, blacksmith Seok." The blacksmith puffed out his chest, clearing his throat as if to press Mujin further. Mujin, however, realized the truth. So the elder blacksmith Seok has retired? That is unfortunate. No wonder there are only a few refreshing works left. Then this new needle must have been crafted by the son. Seok Jisung sighed deeply. I know it is hard to live up to my father, but now even the people at the clinic dare to belittle me. Fine then. With your so-called sharp eye, why don't you try finding my father's works among these? Let us see if you can. Teach me what I lack compared to him. Surely you will not even know the difference. Without hesitation, Mujin walked through the racks of weapons and, one by one, handed Jisung every piece forged by the elder Seok. The young blacksmith's eyes widened in disbelief. What? In an instant, he picked out all of my father's work. Is the difference really that big? He muttered aloud. Most people overlook them because of their simple designs. You have an impressive eye indeed. Mujin smirked to himself. Humph. He must have planned to mock me if I failed. But instead, I proved him wrong. Thanks to him, I am convinced. That dream was not just a dream. Seok Jisung looked at him with a newfound respect. I thought you were just a picky customer, but now I understand. I see why you did not like the needle I made. Although I was the one who asked you to find my father's works, you managed to select every last one of them. Your eye may even surpass mine. He picked up his hammer with a mocking smirk. With me, even if I hammer away endlessly, I can only create mediocre things. So there is only one answer. You must craft something yourself. He thrust the hammer into Mujin's hands. Mujin stood frozen for a moment, stunned. Me? Jisung leaned close with a sneer. If you think it is impossible, then I will craft another needle myself. But you should at least try. Before he could finish, Mujin straightened his shoulders and agreed firmly. All right. After all, when else in life would I ever get the chance to act as a blacksmith? Fine then. Let's go for it. Throwing off his outer clothes, he fed wood and an iron ingot into the furnace, then grabbed the blacksmith's bellows to stoke the flames. Let's start with some simple practice, he declared. I shouted with confidence, trusting the knowledge I gained from that dream. But will it really work? Soon the iron glowed red. Mujin pulled it from the furnace with tongs and laid it upon the anvil. He lifted the hammer and struck it with steady, precise blows, like asking a patient to prepare their own medicine and needle themselves. Still, I want to try hammering. From the side, Seok Ji-sung watched with widening eyes. Mujin hammered the iron repeatedly, his movements calm yet filled with determination. Sweat trickled down his face, but he smiled as the rhythm grew steadier. It is working, he thought with rising excitement. It really works. At first, Ji-sung had expected to laugh at him, but instead his admiration deepened. His hammer blows are flawless. Unlike a physician, he is a natural, just like my father who spent his life forging metal. And this sound, it rings like a clear musical note. His heart trembled. Am I witnessing the reincarnation of Yezi? Is this simply talent? No, this surpasses talent. Show me more. Strike, quench, temper, sharpen the blade. Show me how you make the handle, the sheath. Show me the complete weapon that exists in your mind. But suddenly, Mujin dropped the half-finished blade and ordered firmly, Blacksmith Seok, melt this piece down. Ji-sung stammered in shock. What? Melt it? Mujin nodded. Right. My arms are warmed up enough. Now it is time to make a proper needle. After a while, the needle was complete. Mujin's father tested it immediately on a patient. The same government official who had once complained reluctantly took a seat. The needle slid into his back and he gasped in disbelief. It does not hurt? Really? His back pain faded in an instant. His acquaintances scoffed until they tried it themselves, and their eyes widened in amazement. It actually works. Was the needle really inserted? The attendant chuckled with joy and assured them it had been. Even the official admitted sheepishly that perhaps he had simply been having an off day before. The clinic filled with excited chatter. This is miraculous, truly miraculous. Soon the line to the Tang family clinic grew longer than ever before. Travelers passing by spoke of it as well. One suggested his companion should have visited before leaving the city, while the other complained that the waiting line had been far too long to even get inside. As they walked away, a lone stranger overheard their words. Slowly, he rose from his seat and walked off in the opposite direction. Days later, when the Tang clinic opened once again, a line stretched endlessly outside. Mujin called out for the crowd to wait their turn safely. But before long, a loud commotion erupted inside. A furious voice shouted that he had waited long enough, accusing others of cutting in line and demanding if they even knew who he was. The crowd outside fell silent in fear as the noise grew. Mujin rushed in to see what was happening. His heart lurched when he saw a man lying on the ground with a blade pointed at his chest. The one holding the sword was the same stranger from before, now smirking down at his victim. A quarrel between martial artists? Mujin thought with alarm. The stranger sneered. If you are that eager to know, then let me show you firsthand. With one swift motion, he carved a word into the man's chest. Blood trickled down, though the cut was shallow, harming neither bone nor muscle. Mujin hurried to the man's side to treat him, his eyes widening as he read the bloodied inscription. It spelled, eccentric physician. Mujin's mind raced. With a single strike, he cut only the skin without harming bone or muscle. He is a martial master. And that title, the eccentric physician, I have heard it somewhere before. As the stranger walked away, he turned his head with a grin. You are a grown man, and yet you cry like a child. To faint from such a small cut, I barely scratched you. Apply medicine for a few days and you will be fine. That is, if this were a proper clinic. Mujin's face went pale as the memory returned. I remember now. The physician killer. Eccentric physician, Li Chung. Tang Mujin recalled the image of his father. He remembered how he always felt a deep sense of peace whenever he looked at him. His father might not have been the best physician in the lands, but he was like a strong tree that stood firm in its place. He was not flashy, nor did he chase greatness, but he was resilient. From watching him, Mujin had learned what he believed to be the proper attitude of a physician. When his gaze shifted back to Li Chung, his heart sank. The man before him was the complete opposite of everything his father represented. Li Chung was known across the martial world as the eccentric physician, a martial artist who had reached the pinnacle realm, and one of the 3 greatest physicians under the heavens. He was an unpredictable man, who decided the fates of others, with both his sword and his medical skills. Rumors claimed that his fickle murders did not discriminate between good and evil, and he had already slain dozens of innocent physicians throughout the Jianghu. Mujin's chest tightened as fear overwhelmed him. His father was in danger. As Li Cheng approached the practice chamber, Mujin panicked and shouted desperately. He cried out that the room he was about to enter was his father's practicing chamber, and then he rushed forward, yelling for his father. But before he could reach the door, a strong hand landed on his shoulder. Mujin turned and saw Jin Song, the instructor of the Qingcheng sect branch. The man's voice was low and heavy as he told him that it was inevitable. Mujin protested in disbelief, addressing him as head instructor. He asked what he meant by those words, his voice trembling as he wondered aloud if perhaps the branch leader could stop Li Cheng. Jin Song fell silent for a moment, lowering his eyes before answering. Even his own master, he explained, would refuse to stand against the eccentric physician. Mujin's face paled. He stammered, insisting that the man was a criminal, a murderer known as the eccentric physician. But Jin Song shook his head. His master owed his life to that very man. Mujin was stunned by the revelation. The eccentric physician had once saved the branch leader of the Qingcheng sect. He dropped to his knees in despair, whispering his father's name, powerless to stop what might happen inside. Jin Song placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and told him not to worry. He admitted that Li Cheng was strange, but assured him that he was not truly an evil man. The door to the chamber suddenly slammed open. Both Jin Song and Mujin watched carefully as Li Cheng stepped out. Mujin studied him closely from head to toe, his breath held tight in his chest, until his eyes caught on a small detail. His clothes were spotless. Relief washed over him, and he exhaled shakily, whispering to himself in gratitude that his father was unharmed. But his relief was short-lived. Li Cheng suddenly wrapped an arm around Mujin's shoulder, his lips curling into a mischievous smirk. He greeted him casually and said that after hearing about physician Tang, he had also heard rumors of a skilled blacksmith nearby. He wanted to know if Mujin knew where that man could be found. Mujin's body stiffened. His voice trembled as sweat rolled down his face, but he managed to answer that he did indeed know. Li Cheng grinned and told him to lead the way. Mujin hesitated, glancing at the sword on his back. The older man barked suddenly, demanding to know why he was not moving, his grin widening as he reminded him that he was busy. Terrified, Mujin shouted his obedience and quickly complied. Later, at the blacksmith's forge, blacksmith Xiok inadvertently revealed the truth to Li Cheng. To his surprise, he learned that the miraculous needle had been made not by Xiok, but by Mujin himself. Li Cheng blinked in astonishment before bursting out in roaring laughter. He said he had heard that the strangest things always happened in Sichuan, but never could he have imagined that the son of a physician would know blacksmithing. His laughter shook the room. Curious, Seok Jisung asked Mujin who the old man was, and Mujin replied nervously that he was a martial artist. Li Cheng continued to laugh, brushing the question aside as he waved it away. He then asked Mujin directly if his name was Tang Mujin, and ordered him to make 30 acupuncture needles. Without hesitation, he tossed a gold ingot into his hands as payment. Both Mujin and Jisung cried out in shock when they saw the lump of gold. Mujin immediately grabbed it, bowed deeply, and thanked him. He offered to have the needles ready before the sun set. Li Cheng's eyes widened. He asked incredulously if Mujin truly meant that they would be ready today, not in a few months. Mujin replied with certainty that they would. The eccentric physician remarked that even the most renowned blacksmiths would take several months for such a task, and accused Mujin of lying out of greed. But Mujin insisted fiercely that he could do it by today. He declared that he would craft them fresh out of the furnace, with quality higher than his father's. Jisung vouched for him, saying that Mujin really could do it. After a moment of silence, Li Cheng turned away and sat down. As he spread his clothes, the glint of his sword flashed from his back. Mujin's heart pounded at the reminder of how dangerous this man was. He trembled as Li Cheng grinned at him, his eyes sharp, and told him that he had better keep his word. Mujin nodded frantically, stammering that he would. The furnace roared with heavy smoke as Mujin fed it wood and pumped the bellows. Jisung worked beside him, lending his hands. From nearby, Li Cheng watched carefully, his sharp eyes never leaving Mujin's movements. In his thoughts, he considered the process. Crafting acupuncture needles was a grueling task that required producing large amounts of wire, then selecting only the best before grinding them to a fine point. The needles that physician Tang had used before were not simply the product of luck. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. As he studied Mujin, he noted with surprise that the boy had a fairly fit body for a physician. His suspicion deepened as his gaze followed every hammer strike. Mujin worked tirelessly, and after some time, he presented the finished needles. With a respectful tone, he thanked Li Chung for waiting and offered them. That was when the eccentric physician made an unexpected request. He asked Tang Mujin to become his disciple. Mujin was stunned. Confused, he asked why such a man would want him as a disciple. Li Chung rose from his seat, his eyes gleaming. He said that a boy like Mujin should not rot away in a small town as a mere physician. If he disliked the idea, he could refuse. But he wanted him to consider the opportunity. Mujin hesitated. He admitted he was not uninterested, but reminded him that he had a clinic to run, and was only beginning to grow accustomed to working at the forge. He also questioned what exactly he could learn from a man like Li Chung. The eccentric physician scoffed at his uncertainty. With a sudden flick of his sword, he unleashed his speed. Acupuncture needles flew through the air before anyone noticed, slicing through a whetstone and even embedding themselves into Seok Jisung's shoulder. Both Mujin and Jisung were stunned, unable to comprehend how it had happened. Li Chung smirked and declared that he could teach two things: martial arts and medicine. He asked if Mujin was not interested. Mujin's heart raced as he thought. Becoming the disciple of a pinnacle realm martial artist and one of the three greatest physicians was an opportunity beyond anything he had ever imagined. He realized that with such a master, even the Qingcheng sect would not dare interfere with his family's clinic. Gathering his courage, he asked why Li Chung had chosen him specifically. The older man replied without hesitation. It was convenient to travel with a quick-healing blacksmith. In return, he would teach him martial arts and medicine. Mujin frowned and asked if that was not more like a contractual relationship than a true disciple and master bond. Li Chung laughed and told him to call it whatever he wished. To test him further, he suddenly posed a medical question. What would he do if a patient with weak qi began trembling in their limbs? Mujin answered immediately. He explained that he would first treat the imbalance in the patient's fluids, and then prescribe medicine made from poria and licorice root. Li Chung grinned, praising him for passing the test. Mujin blinked in confusion, wondering what test he had just passed. Wrapping an arm around Mujin's shoulders, Li Chung told him that if he was sharp enough to have memorized the Shanghan Lun and the Neijing texts, then he could also learn martial arts. Mujin blinked in disbelief and asked what that had to do with martial arts at all. Li Chung scoffed at the question, reminding him that martial arts was not only about strength. He explained that some fools could never progress because they lacked understanding, swinging their swords all their lives yet stagnating at third or second rate. When Mujin asked if he could become a first-rate martial artist, Li Chung's expression shifted slightly. He said that whether a student surpassed his master depended more on the master's teaching than the student's talent. Later that day, Mujin returned home to the Tang residence, his mind still whirling. His eyes lit up with amazement as he realized what it meant. At the very least, he could one day reach the pinnacle realm. His lips parted into a wide smile, and he began to hop around in excitement, copying martial stances clumsily as he cried out the words, "Pinnacle realm." But in his joy, he tripped and fell to the ground. At that moment, his father appeared. Mujin scrambled to his feet and bowed respectfully, apologizing for being late. His father's hands trembled as he grabbed his son by the shoulders, his expression filled with overwhelming worry and tears welling in his eyes. He admitted that he had been deathly afraid when he heard Mujin had been taken by the eccentric physician. He had thought Li Chung was merely a curious wanderer when he first entered the chamber, but feared the worst when he realized who he was. He asked desperately if his son was unharmed. Mujin reassured him that he was fine. He explained that Li Chung was not as dangerous as the rumors claimed. His father nodded, saying that Jin Song had told him the same, and expressed his relief that he was safe. He then asked why it had taken him so long to return, since he thought his son was only guiding the man to the blacksmith. Mujin hesitated, then admitted the truth. Li Chung had asked him to become his disciple, giving him until the following night to decide. He muttered that the man truly was eccentric to make such an offer so suddenly. His father froze in place. Mujin called to him several times, but he remained unmoving. Then, without warning, His father rushed back into his chamber. Moments later, he emerged again and pressed several silver ingots into Mujin's hands. Mujin stared at them in confusion and asked why he was being given so much silver. His father looked at him with urgency and told him to go. Mujin protested. He reminded him that their clinic was already short-handed and suggested that perhaps Li Cheng was only mocking him with his offer. His father leaned forward and gripped his shoulders tightly. He said firmly that the clinic would be fine. Now was the only time for Mujin to leave. In that moment, Mujin understood. His father, the man he had always seen as a sturdy tree standing unshaken, revealed to him something important. There had once been a time when even his father was just a boy as well. Tang Mujin reflected in silence, his thoughts consumed by the progress he had made. It had been the second day since he began learning martial arts, and he had succeeded in circulating qi around his body for the very first time. The sensation was unlike anything he had felt before. After 3 days, then 4, he noticed that although the flow of qi was still faint, it was undeniably growing within him, little by little. He tried to put his feelings into words. It was not merely that he felt stronger. It was more like he had taken a decisive step forward. He thought to himself that now was the only time he could leave, and with gratitude in his heart, he silently thanked his father. While he sat deep in meditation, an acorn suddenly dropped onto his head. Startled, Tang Mujin looked up and spotted his master, Li Cheng, sitting casually on a branch above him. Li Cheng looked down and asked if Mujin was already homesick. Tang Mujin quickly denied it, addressing him respectfully. Li Cheng dropped from the branch to the ground with ease, landing before his disciple. Tang Mujin admitted that he believed his qi had increased since the day before. Li Cheng's eyes lit up with amusement as he told him that this was the period when martial arts felt the most fun. Mujin smiled and suggested that perhaps he truly had some talent, as Li Cheng had once said. Li Cheng scoffed at the notion, repeating the word talent in a mocking tone. He admitted that Mujin was not too bad, but explained that the speed at which he gained qi was about average. Mujin protested with a grin. He pointed out that he had learned to circulate qi in just 2 days, while most people usually required 10. He muttered to himself in awe, convinced that the dream he once had of Uyezi must have blessed him with martial talent. Li Cheng, confused by his words, asked what kind of blessing he was speaking about. Before Mujin could elaborate, Li Cheng suddenly handed him a sword and pointed a wooden stick toward him. With a sly smile, he proposed a challenge. If Mujin was truly confident, he should test his skills. Li Cheng promised to give him some teachings, and even declared that if Mujin could so much as scratch the hem of his clothes, he would carry him on his back until they left Sichuan province. Mujin hesitated, drawing the blade slightly. Fear crept into his voice as he pointed out that it was a real weapon, dangerously sharp. He fretted aloud that his master could die if he struck him. Then his thoughts shifted. Perhaps, with the skills he had trained for the past 10 days, he might succeed. Maybe, he thought, if he attempted a sneak attack while his master was unprepared. With a wild grin, Mujin suddenly lunged forward, sword in hand. Li Cheng remained completely unfazed. He chuckled, noting that Mujin was eager to take the first strike, and teased him for believing he had gained guts and talent in only 10 days. Mujin swung his sword, but Li Cheng calmly raised his stick to block the attack. Mujin's eyes widened in disbelief. It was only a stick, yet his sword had failed to leave even a scratch upon it. Li Cheng's tone grew serious as he warned his student to grit his teeth. Mujin stammered in confusion, asking what he meant. In that moment, qi surged around Li Cheng's wooden stick. His lips curled into a wide smirk. Mujin's senses screamed in alarm. What he felt was no mere ripple of energy, nor a current. It was far larger, far more overwhelming. A sudden burst of qi rushed at him, striking with crushing force. The impact sent Mujin's body flying. He dropped his sword and collapsed to his knees, vomiting fluids onto the ground. Li Cheng stood proudly beside him and asked how it felt to receive qi head-on for the first time. Mujin groaned, clutching his stomach. He complained that it was unfair, exclaiming that such battles simply proved whoever had the larger amount of qi would always win. Li Cheng laughed at his reaction. He admitted that perhaps Mujin was right in one sense, but explained that he himself did not possess a large reserve of qi, which was why he avoided such direct contests. Martial arts, he reminded his disciple, was not nearly so simple. Then he questioned why Mujin seemed so frustrated, reminding him that he was first and foremost a physician, not a warrior. He asked if there was anyone he bore a grudge against. Mujin pouted, standing up. He reminded his master that he had promised to make him a martial artist of the pinnacle realm. If one's prowess was decided entirely by the amount of ki, then he would never be able to achieve it. Li Chung promptly struck him on the head with his stick. He scolded him, explaining that even if his ki was weak and his moves were not flashy, there were still countless paths toward becoming a martial master. When Mujin had received his surge of chi just now, he had instinctively tried to force his own chi into the sword before giving up. That, Li Chung said, was a valid pathway as well. He then instructed Mujin to attack him again, promising not to use ki this time. Mujin gripped the sword tightly, gathering his resolve. He declared that he would come at him once more. He leapt forward, swinging with determination. Their weapons clashed, and to his astonishment, the blade managed to slightly cut into Li Chung's wooden stick. Mujin's eyes widened in disbelief and triumph, but his moment of victory was fleeting. In an instant, Li Chung struck him in the forehead, the side of his neck, and his chest. Mujin collapsed to the ground, defeated. Li Chung approached him with a slight laugh, pointing out that even without using ki, Mujin would have already died 3 times. He noted that Mujin's ki-gathering speed was not particularly fast. When Mujin managed to stand again, Li Chung tapped him lightly on the head with the stick and continued his lecture. He explained that Mujin was not gifted with the ability to extend greater chi than most. Mujin yelped in pain, clutching his head. But Li Chung's tone softened. He told his disciple that despite his shortcomings, he undoubtedly possessed strengths of his own. His sense of ki was remarkably accurate, and he wielded it quickly and precisely. Although his skills with the sword were barely of a third-rate level, the fact that he had instinctively imbued his weapon with ki meant that he was fit to be considered at least a second-rate martial artist. Or better. With enough time spent exploring his path, Li Chung believed it could grow into something greater. Leaning forward with a proud smile, he told Mujin that his progress was excellent for only 10 days of training. Mujin paused, then asked if that meant he was already a second-rate martial artist. Li Chung struck him lightly again, muttering that he should not have given him a compliment. Unfazed, Mujin shouted with excitement, declaring himself a genius. Before Li Chung could respond, the sound of rustling bushes interrupted them. Both master and disciple turned their heads. Mujin speculated that it might be a wild animal, but Li Chung corrected him, saying the sound belonged to a person. He lowered himself, observing carefully, as a figure emerged from the trees. They noticed a rope tied around the man's waist, nodded 3 times. Li Chung recognized the sign and whispered to Mujin that the man was a branch leader. Mujin's eyes widened in shock. That meant the stranger was a martial artist at the pinnacle realm. After speaking with the man, they learned that he was Hong Jusan, the branch leader of Jewel Village. He explained his purpose in the forest, speaking of an unidentifiable disease spreading through his home. Li Chung asked if it was true, and Jusan nodded. He explained that a month earlier, villagers began falling ill. At first they thought it was a typical spring cough, but the sickness spread quickly. Half the village was now infected, and 20 had already died. Many villagers chose to flee, but Jusan could not abandon the place where he had lived his entire life. Together with his master, he had been caring for the sick. Their village physician had tried to help as well, but when his herbs ran out, he promised to climb the mountain for more. He had not returned since. Jusan smiled gratefully at them, thanking them for helping him find his way back. After some time, the 3 of them arrived at Jewel Village. At the entrance, they were greeted by Jusan's master, Hong Gyun, the village guardian known as the Hemp Harvest Beggar. He welcomed them warmly and ushered them inside. There, they found a child lying on a bed, covered in red spots across his body. Tang Mujin examined the boy closely, checking his pulse. He noticed the child was sweating profusely, his pulse weak yet rapid. His ears burned hot while his hands remained cold. Warm ki was surging unnaturally toward his head. Mujin asked the boy's father if his son had vomited recently. The man nodded, saying the child had complained of dizziness and headaches. Li Chung observed quietly from behind, while Mujin pieced together his thoughts. Mujin announced his findings. The boy was suffering from damp fever, showing signs of a plague. His pulse was too fast, his chi flow uneven, his breathing troubled, and he vomited often. Mujin explained that it was similar to summer heat flu but distinct, as it lacked the disease's peculiar odor. If left untreated, the heat pooling in his head would eventually render him blind or retarded. He suggested acupuncture at several points, including the foot, the forehead, the brow, and the crown of the head. He also listed the proper herbs to use: Ophiophagon, Trichosanthes, Platycodon, and Fritillaries. Li Chung smiled faintly and told him that he had studied the Neijing texts well. He encouraged him to proceed with acupuncture. Mujin hesitated, nervous about performing the procedure for the first time, but steadied himself. His hand shook slightly as he gripped the needle and positioned it at the boy's foot. His master leaned forward, pressing his own fingers to guide him. He asked if Mujin truly thought learning to use qi in martial arts had been so simple. Then, Li Chung poured his own qi into both Mujin and the child, allowing the flow to guide him. He explained that for a physician, such a keen sense of qi was an incredible fortune. Mujin's eyes widened as he felt his master's qi guiding his own. To him, it was as clear as stones beneath a flowing stream. But alongside it, he sensed something far more ominous: deathly qi. Li Chung confirmed that he had sensed it as well. He instructed him to perform the acupuncture and observe carefully how it reacted. Mujin nodded firmly and carried out the procedure. The people surrounding him watched in anxious silence. After a tense wait, the child released a breath as the deathly qi left his body. Relief swept through the room, and everyone sighed. Mujin exhaled deeply and let out a shaky laugh of his own, grateful for the success. But before he could relax fully, Li Chung grasped his hand. His master looked at him with a firm yet proud smile. Mujin gazed up at him with wide eyes. Li Chung told him that this day was one in which he had learned many important lessons. But more than anything, seeing the look of satisfaction on his face proved that he had truly become a proper physician. Later that day, Tang, Mujin, and Li Chung walked through the village, accompanied by one of the villagers. As they moved, they conversed about the physician of the village. The villager explained that when the disease had spread, Physician Yum had used his own savings to treat the sick. He had told everyone that only herbs from a distant land would be effective, and so he gave all his money to herb traders. Hearing this, Tang Mujin remarked that he must be a good man. The villager agreed and went on to say that, after learning of his devotion, everyone else in the village pooled their money together and gave it to him as well, telling him to buy more herbs from the trade. However, because herb traders rarely visited a small mountain village like theirs, Physician Yum went into the mountains to find enough herbs to last until the traders returned. The villager admitted that he personally had not liked Jusan, thinking him a man who did nothing but fool around all day. Yet if Jusan had not guided the two of them there, his son would have already been lost. His voice faltered for a moment before he said with relief that his son's recovery had eased his heart. He then pointed to a nearby house and told them that they could stay there. Though it was empty, he hoped it would not be too uncomfortable and wished them a good rest. As they entered the house, Li Chung examined it carefully. He noticed carvings on the furniture that looked as though they had been drawn by a child. His eyes then fell upon a small doll lying on the ground. He stared at it for a moment before picking it up and placing it gently on a nearby table. While he was still lost in thought, Tang Mujin spoke suddenly, causing him to startle. Mujin asked if Physician Yum was a good physician. Li Chung blinked and replied that he was referring to Yum, yes, and that he appeared to be. He added that they would meet him in person soon. Mujin frowned and wondered aloud why such a disease was spreading in a village full of kind people. He gestured toward the food and gifts laid out for them. Li Chung instructed him to eat only a little and return the rest before they left. He said there was no need to burden the villagers further with their appetites. Mujin nodded in agreement, and they sat down to eat and drink together. After a pause, Mujin asked what his master thought the disease might be. Li Chung admitted that although he knew of similar illnesses, something about this one felt unusual. He said it might even be a disease he had never encountered before. Mujin stared at him in shock and asked if there were truly illnesses unknown even to the greatest physicians. Li Chung answered calmly that there were far more things he did not know than the things he did. Every time he learned one thing, 5 more questions appeared for which he had no answers. Mujin murmured that he had thought his master knew every disease in the world. Li Chung laughed softly and told him that of course he did not. If he had known every illness, he would not still be wandering the lands. Mujin hesitated, then asked if there was a specific disease his master wished to cure. Li Chung grew quiet. At last, he said that there used to be one. He knew the cure now, but when it had mattered, he had been too late. Mujin repeated the word softly, asking what he meant by late. Before Li Chung could answer, cries rang out from the village beyond the window. Mujin glanced toward it, his inner thoughts heavy. He thought to himself that they needed medicine, but without a proper diagnosis, it was useless. If only they knew the exact illness, they could cure it. Then Li Chung spoke. His voice was steady, though a shadow passed through his eyes. He told his disciple that his wife and daughter had died from an illness. One day, both had developed a severe fever, and red spots spread across their bodies. He had rushed them to a physician, and even brought another from a neighboring village known for his skill, but neither had known the cure. While he was still searching for another physician, both his wife and daughter had died. It had all happened just 3 days after their first symptoms. Mujin was struck silent. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled as he said he prayed they had found peace in the afterlife. Li Chung cut him off with a bitter smile. He told him not to pray. He explained that he was not denying the story, but in fact, he thought Mujin might even chuckle when he heard what came after. He lifted his drink and continued. He said that after losing them, he had struggled. Acting on impulse, as if driven by something unseen, he had left his hometown. About 10 days later, he arrived at a small village, though the distance should have only taken him a day. He had wandered like a beggar along the way. That village had its own physician. Li Chung described him vividly, saying he looked like a rat, a man one would not normally trust, a typical small village physician. Yet, for reasons he did not understand, he told the man about his wife and daughter's symptoms. The physician had shrugged and told him, "Oh, just give me 5 coins. They will be cured if they eat this medicine on time, no problem." At the time, Li Chung had dozens of silver coins in his pocket. Not just a handful, but enough to pay for his daughter's marriage several times over. He realized then that his wife and daughter had not died because he lacked money, nor because he had sought out poor physicians, nor because there had not been enough herbs. No, they had died simply because the physicians he had taken them to had not known what this one humble man knew. He asked Mujin if he had ever heard such a laughable story. That, he explained, was the reason he had become a physician himself. He wished to gather all the medical knowledge in the world into one place. After 30 years, he confessed, he could no longer remember what his wife and daughter even looked like. He chuckled, though the sound carried a pain too deep to conceal. Silence followed, and Mujin gazed out the window. In his thoughts, he compared his master's chuckle to the cries of grief echoing outside. The next day, Mujin told Li Chung that he wanted to look around the village to see if he could identify the source of the disease. His master raised a brow at the word source, but agreed. He told him that he would also take a look, and warned that if he caught Mujin slacking off, he would be dead. Mujin quickly assured him not to worry. Together with Hongju-san and the elder Hongyun, Mujin moved around the village. They arrived first at the pig pen, where Mujin observed the animals carefully. Afterward, they inspected the well, and then the underground storage, searching every corner. Finally, they arrived at a house. Mujin asked if this was the home of Old Man Zhong, the first to fall ill. Hongyun confirmed that it was. Mujin thought carefully. In his mind, he recalled the difference between cool illnesses and warm illnesses. Cool illnesses chilled the body, while warm illnesses heated it up. Though their symptoms varied, both were caused by deathly qi created in shaded, cool, and foul-smelling places. Yet the pigsty, the well, and the storage had shown no traces of deathly qi. Normally, plagues spread outward from their origin point. He asked the 2 men to confirm whether Zhong had been the first to fall ill and whether his neighbors had followed afterward. Hongju-san frowned, uncertain, then admitted that people in the western part of the village had fallen ill first. Yes, he agreed. Those in the west had grown sick more quickly than those in the east, and children had seemed particularly vulnerable. The clues still did not add up in Mujin's mind. He asked if there was any difference between the western and eastern parts of the village, reasoning that there must be a reason it began there. He added that he had heard the east carried more yang energy, while the west leaned toward yin. Mujin dismissed that idea, pointing out that he had traveled from the west without encountering any plague. He also asked why the children were affected faster. All children did, after all, spend their time playing together. At that, both Juzan and Hongyun admitted that the children often played in the stream flowing through the western side of the village. Mujin's thoughts raced. Could it be the water? Yet he remembered the well in the east, and that the water there had been fine. He asked if the eastern well always dried up. Hongyun replied that it only happened occasionally during the spring drought. Mujin asked if the plague's outbreak aligned with that time, and Hongyun agreed that it did. Mujin's eyes widened as realization struck him. He thought to himself that it must be because the eastern well had dried up, forcing everyone to rely on the western stream. That would explain why the western villagers, and especially the children who played in the water, had fallen ill first. The three of them then went to the suspected stream. Mujin investigated it closely. To the eye, nothing appeared wrong. The water was not cloudy, nor did it smell foul, yet every clue pointed to it. He wondered if sensing it directly was the only way to be sure. He bent down, scooped a small amount of the water, and drank it. Sitting cross-legged, he meditated and examined his body from within. Behind him, Jusan muttered in surprise and asked if he had ever seen a physician meditate like this before. Hongyun told him to let the young man do his work. Inside his own body, Mujin concentrated deeply. Before long, he felt the same deathly ki that he had detected in the sick villagers. His eyes flew open. He stood up abruptly and shouted that it was the same deathly ki. He pointed upstream, yelling that he had figured it out and urging the others to follow him. The three of them hurried along the stream until Mujin suddenly caught a foul odor on the air. He stopped and asked aloud if the others could smell it too. Jusan confirmed it, saying the stench was growing stronger. Mujin said that meant they were close. As they pressed forward, the smell became unbearable, and they had to cover their noses. Mujin gagged inwardly, thinking that even the trees around them were dying. They were nearing the source. At last, after a few more steps, they found it. Mujin's eyes widened, and he cried out. He exclaimed in horror, asking if the ground itself was rotting. He pointed at it and declared that something was buried beneath. Tang Mujin recalled the familiar atmosphere of the herb storage. He remembered how that place always carried the scent of life and death intertwined. There were always deaths there, the death of plants, the death of animals. Yet despite that, the storage of medicine never smelled foul. Instead, it carried a strangely comforting odor, one that brought peace to the heart. He had always liked that smell. To him, it was the scent of death that held the key to life, an odor that promised recovery for someone who was suffering. Now, however, as he dug through the rotten ground, the air was different. What filled his nose was no longer the fragrance of healing, but the stench of pure decay. It was death without life, death that spread only more death. His mind raced. Who had done this? And for what reason? As the digging continued, they unearthed the rotting corpses of animals buried beneath the soil. Tang Mujin's expression hardened, and he instructed in a firm voice that they should dig them out completely and move them away from the stream before the contamination spread further. Hong Jusan lifted what appeared to be the severed leg of one of the animals. His face twisted in disgust as he showed it to his master. "Master, look at this," he said. Elder Hongyun inspected it and gave a grim observation. Someone cut it off deliberately and burned it. Tang Mujin's thoughts sharpened. He knew exactly what this meant. Corpse poison. It was a toxin that did not kill instantly like poisonous herbs or minerals from the earth. Instead, it caused slow and lingering death, bringing illness even with the slightest exposure. Whoever had done this was fully aware of its qualities. The timing was deliberate as well, coinciding with when the village well had dried up. Their true purpose became horrifyingly clear. It was not simple sabotage. It was annihilation. A sudden crack echoed from behind them, the sharp sound of a branch snapping underfoot. Tang Mujin turned quickly. His eyes widened as he saw a masked figure holding a sack in one hand and a knife in the other. The man pulled off his mask, revealing his face, and shouted with anger. "What the hell are you doing to the field I put so much effort into?" Hong Jusan and Hongyun froze in shock. Their bodies trembled as recognition hit them. They could not believe what they were seeing. Their voices stammered in disbelief, calling out the name that shook Tang Mujin to his core. Physician Yom. Could it be? Even Tang Mujin's heart faltered at the revelation. In his mind, he repeated the words with dread. Physician Yom? The pieces came together with terrifying clarity. Yom knew exactly what corpse poison could do. He understood the state of the village better than anyone. He had even begun collecting money once the disease had spread. Tang Mujin realized with horror that he was the culprit. This man was no healer. He was a demon in human skin, a smiling physician who hid his greed behind false kindness. Tang Mujin's fury burned as the thought struck him. To think that Yom would reveal a greed capable of swallowing the entire Zhul village in such a way, and to be so brazen even after being discovered. His hand gripped his stick tightly. He was ready to kill. Yet before he could act, Elder Hongyun stepped forward. His face twisted with rage as he confronted the truth. So this was your doing? You created the disease and then pretended to treat the people? He shouted. His hand lifted a rotten goat's head from the pile of corpses as evidence. Yom paused for only a moment before a twisted grin spread across his face. I have been nice all along, he sneered. So I just wanted to take my share in the end. Hongyun's teeth ground together, his anger erupting. Share? Your share, he roared before hurling the decayed goat's head at Yom. His voice thundered with grief and rage. Do you even know how many people have died? Yom flinched as the head flew toward him but quickly cut it in half with a flash of his blade. He snarled back without hesitation. And why the hell would I care? At that moment, 2 armed men appeared, stepping forward to stand beside him. Yom's expression grew darker. All I care about is that you've ruined my efforts, he said coldly. So you can pay the price with your bodies. Whether it is today or another day. I was planning to throw your corpses into that hole anyway. Just think of this as being early in line, you fucking beggars. Elder Hongyun's fury boiled over. He stomped the ground, his voice shaking the air as he shouted, You bastards! The movement caught the attention of the 2 armed men, and their eyes darted to the knots on his waist. He raised his voice again, his presence growing overwhelming. How dare you do this when a guardian of the beggar sect stands before you? I, hemp-harvesting beggar Hongyun, am here. Everyone froze. Even Yom's bravado faltered. His voice stuttered as he recoiled in shock. A guardian? The 2 armed men turned on him immediately, their confidence breaking. A guardian? One of them repeated in panic. The other shouted at Yom. Hey! You said there were only weaklings of the beggar sect here. What is this? Yom's face paled, his words stumbling. I don't know. Elder Hongyun's stick slammed against the earth once more. He pointed it forward with authority. You brats, listen well. I will count to 10. The only one who will die to my club is the true culprit. Physician Yom, you are responsible. I do not wish to cause more deaths in this village, so make the right choice now. His voice was iron. Then he began his count. 1. Tang Mujin muttered under his breath, still trying to grasp what he had just witnessed. Hemp-harvesting beggar. His thoughts spun as he realized the sheer force of will contained in just the old man's shout. Hongju-san suddenly appeared at his back, whispering with urgency. Physician Tang, you must run now. Tang Mujin blinked in shock. What? Run away? Yes, Jusan insisted. Run away. I will throw you over the stream. Run as fast as you can. Do not look back and tell the village what is happening. Hongyun's voice boomed again. 2. Jusan's whisper grew more desperate. I am sorry to burden you with such a task again, but please. Tang Mujin's voice trembled as he whispered back. But you 2 are the branch leader and guardian. You are martial artists of the Pinnacle Realm. You could easily… Jusan looked at him with confusion. Pinnacle Realm? Hongyun continued. 3. Tang Mujin froze, his mind stumbling over the realization. They weren't Pinnacle Realm martial artists? Jusan's expression steeled. Anyway, my master and I must fight. On Yom's side, he shoved the 2 men forward, shouting with impatience. It's just 2 beggars and 1 physician. It's now or never. Do you intend to fight the whole village? Hongyun's voice thundered again. 4. Tang Mujin's chest tightened as the truth dawned on him. The old beggar truly intended to die fighting. But why? Why would a weak beggar go so far? His whisper cracked as he turned to Jusan again. What if we all ran together? The eccentric physician is a real Pinnacle Realm martial master. If we make it to the village… 5. Hongyun declared. Jusen grabbed Tang Mujin firmly under his arms. His voice was heavy with sincerity. We cannot protect you with our skills if we run. Please, protect the village together with the eccentric physician. We have begged our entire lives in this village, but we have never been ashamed. The villagers' generosity has kept us alive. 6, Hongyun continued, his count steady. Jusan's eyes did not waver. Master told me that when the time comes, we must fight for the villagers. 7, came Hongyun's voice again. Yom grew more frantic, his face twisting as he yelled. If we run now, our gambling debts won't go away. Kill him. You only live once. The two armed men lunged forward. Hongyun narrowed his eyes and braced himself for combat. The two shouted with reckless desperation. All right, let's just give it a shot. Panic surged in Jusan. He acted without hesitation, throwing Tang Mujin toward the other side of the stream. His voice cracked as he shouted, Please, physician! Run! Tang Mujin's mind reeled. Run! But what about the two of them? Should I help? The enemies don't seem very strong. His thoughts raced. If I fight together with them, maybe we could win. One of the attackers swung his blade toward Tang Mujin, but Jusan intercepted it just in time. Mujin's body was hurled over the stream. Without stopping, his legs carried him forward, running as fast as he could. As he fled, his heart pounded. His thoughts tore into him. I am not wrong for running away. I am just fulfilling their request. I must deliver their message to save Jules Village. But the truth struck him like a knife. Bullshit. I am running away. The hemp-harvesting beggar and the red beggar. Both of them will die. What can I do when I have just begun to learn martial arts? His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his legs faltering. He stopped for a moment, his thoughts burning inside him. If I were a pinnacle realm master, I would not run. He clenched his fists, his breathing harsh. Then another thought broke through the fear. But the red beggar chose to stay, despite not being a pinnacle realm martial master. Resolve hardened within him. Tang Mujin turned back, his decision made. Tang Mujin darted back toward the battlefield, his mind racing. He remembered a time when he had stood up for a child who was being bullied by the young heirs of the Qingcheng sect. That day, he had been beaten. But instead of pain, he had felt pride. In that moment, he had believed he was a martial master standing against injustice. Now, however, cowardly thoughts clouded him. He caught himself wishing the path were longer, or that the fight would already be over by the time he arrived. Yet deep down he knew that if he ran away now, he would only spend his entire life running away. With that heavy thought, he pressed forward. When Mujin reached the clearing, he hid behind a tree and watched the battle unfold. Hongyun and Hongjusan were already severely wounded, pressed back and breathing heavily as they stood back to back against their enemies. Panic welled inside Mujin as he asked himself what he should do. One of the enemies sneered and lunged at Jusan, shouting that a bad dog bares its teeth. Jusan blocked the first strike, but was forced back as the enemy attacked again. He barely managed to dodge, but the opponent's blade grazed his knee, sending him stumbling to the ground. As the attacker bore down on him, Jusan managed to block with his stick, straining to hold the strike at bay. Nearby, Elder Hongyun noticed Jusan's struggle and shouted at him to get a grip and stand back up. At that moment, his own opponent attacked, forcing the elder to dodge quickly. The enemy taunted him, asking who he was worried about, and mocked him for rolling away to gain distance. Hongyun spat back that it was better to fight dirty than to die, and that it was still better than committing evil like his opponent. The enemy scoffed and pointed toward Jusan, jeering that both master and disciple would die regardless. He mocked the elder for wanting to witness his disciple chopped into pieces and used as fertilizer. With a sneer, he called it pathetic to see such an old man clinging desperately to life. Hongyun glanced over his shoulder and noticed a stick on the ground. He also caught sight of Jusan still struggling to fend off his enemy. With fierce resolve, he declared that giving up was nonsense. As his opponent leapt toward him, the elder rolled to the side, seizing the stick. His enemy roared in fury and demanded he die, swinging violently. Instead of retreating, Hongyun grabbed a fistful of dirt from the ground. Jusan, noticing his master's danger, kicked his own opponent to the ground to intervene. The elder threw the dirt, but the enemy dodged. Seizing the moment, Hongyun lunged forward, grabbing the enemy tightly around the body. The man sneered. raising his axe high, and shouted that it was time for the elder to die. He hacked deep into Hongyun's back, blood gushing from the wound. Despite the agony, Hongyun held on with all his strength and roared his disciple's name. Jusan turned in shock at the cry. The enemy thrashed wildly, cursing and demanding that Hongyun let go, striking his back with the axe again. The elder's voice was raw with desperation as he shouted once more, telling Jusan that now was the time to pay back the villagers for the food they had given. Fueled by rage, Jusan leapt forward with a furious cry. At that moment, Hongyun lost consciousness, but even unconscious, his grip pinned the enemy in place. Another enemy rushed in to intercept, sword raised, but before he could strike, a rock flew from the distance and struck him in the face. Tang Mujin had thrown it with all his strength. The struck enemy cursed the physician, but Jusan took the chance, roaring his technique. With a powerful swing, he brought down his club in a bold club head smash, crushing the skull of the enemy his master was holding. Both the elder and his foe collapsed together to the ground. Mujin went silent, frozen by the gravity of the moment. Then the other enemy turned toward him, enraged. He shouted that Mujin should have kept running, and that since he was eager to die, he would chop him into pieces. Mujin clutched another rock in his hand, ready to throw. But before he could, the man's head was severed in an instant. Li Chung had appeared. He stood calmly, his blade dripping, and remarked that Mujin had come a long way to discover the source of the disease. Mujin, relieved, called him sir. Li Chung scanned the battlefield with a sharp gaze. He noticed the rotting corpses buried nearby, then turned to look at the collapsed Hongyun and the crying Jusun who held his master in his lap. Li Chung asked if those men were the culprits. Mujin quickly denied it and pointed to physician Yom, declaring that Yom was the true criminal. Startled, Yom froze, but before he could flee, Li Chung appeared behind him in a blur, seizing him by the head and slamming him to the ground. Looking down coldly, Li Chung asked Yom if he had created the plague and demanded to know why. Mujin, filled with rage, kicked Yom in the head and shouted that he had done it for money. Yom cried out, begging for mercy. Li Chung stopped Mujin, narrowing his eyes. He told Yom that money was not his true goal, and asked what he had really been after. Both Mujin and Yom blinked in shock. Yom, trembling, tried to bargain for his life. He said he could offer them a cultivating medicine of immense value and asked if they had ever heard of the black peony herb. Mujin's eyes widened as he recalled what he knew. The black peony herb bloomed in places filled with chaotic negative energy. Though it was a step below treasures like the 10,000-year-old snow ginseng or the grand rejuvenation pill, it was still one of the most famous and coveted herbs, known as the flower of heroes. Yom pointed toward a small cave nearby and insisted he would give them the herb if they spared him. Mujin and Li Chung turned sharply to look. Mujin saw it and exclaimed that it truly was the black peony herb. His fury swelled as he realized Yom had orchestrated all this, and yet now was willing to hand it over just to save his own life. He moved to strike Yom, but Li Chung stopped him again. Li Chung explained that Yom was not really trying to exchange his life for the herb. The black peony could not be harvested safely by ordinary men. Its deathly energy would kill them. He accused Yom of feeding it with corpses to help it grow, planning to use the villagers, and perhaps even them, as sacrifices. He added that Yom might have been planning to offer the flower only to poison them once their guard was down. Yom, trembling in guilt, pressed his forehead to the ground and insisted it was not so. He said the black peony required delicate preparation, and that he merely wanted to present it to them properly. Li Chung scoffed, saying Yom was far too knowledgeable for a mere mountain village physician. Yom laughed nervously, calling it a trick he had picked up. Li Chung walked toward the cave and reached for the flower. Yom's eyes widened in disbelief as Li Chung grasped it barehanded. He stammered that touching it should mean instant death. But Li Chung, his tone cold, replied that he would decide when he lived or died. Without hesitation, he swung his blade and severed Yom's head. The corpse fell and silence settled over the clearing. Li Chung sneered in irritation as he looked down at the corpse of the physician. He muttered that he did not understand why subhuman physicians like this kept appearing, and wondered aloud if they thought they could call themselves physicians just because they knew a little medicine. Tang Mujin glanced at him nervously and asked if he was all right, his eyes fixed on the ominous herb in Li Chung's hand. He asked about the flower, his voice filled with worry. Li Chung scoffed at his concern and replied with confidence. He said, of course he was fine, and asked if Tang Mujin really believed he had earned his title through gambling. He declared that he would remove the poison of the black peony herb and the corpses, instructing Tang Mujin to take Red Beggar back up. Mujin nodded and hurried over to Hongju-san, helping him support his wounded master. At the same time, his eyes drifted back to Li Chung. He watched as the man seated himself in a meditation position. Li Chung began to draw the deadly energy from the herb. The air grew thick and heavy, the disgusting stench spread across the clearing, and the black qi that clung to the flower seeped outward, gathering ominously around them. Mujin's eyes widened in panic. He muttered in disbelief that the poison was being sucked in and tried to steady himself against the overwhelming pressure. His inner voice trembled as he admitted that the stench was unbearable. But then, little by little, the dark qi dissipated until finally it vanished altogether. Mujin's body loosened in relief. He thought to himself that it must be over. Li Chung then turned to him and asked if he had gotten a good look. He said that this was what it took to call oneself skilled at qi meditation. With a small smirk, he told Mujin to take it. Mujin blinked in confusion and asked what he meant. Li Chung replied that he had removed all the poison, so Mujin should be able to consume the herb without any problems. He added that it had been purified by his excellent skills and asked with a hint of arrogance if it was not amazing. Mujin, still uncertain, and stammered out his thanks. Li Chung handed the flower to him, saying that Mujin had figured out the physician's plot, and therefore, he deserved it. The young physician stared at the flower in his hand. The word deserve echoed in his mind. He looked over at Hongju-san, and then at the lifeless elder Honggyun, grief tightening his chest. Slowly, he shook his head. He admitted aloud that he did not deserve such a thing. All he had done was return halfway, throw a single stone, and only because he had been afraid of being called a coward. Li Chung smirked at his words and repeated the word deserve in a thoughtful tone. He then approached and pointed toward Hongju-san. He asked Mujin how he explained the look on Jusan's face, which clearly seemed to say that Mujin deserved it. Jusan himself nodded firmly in agreement. Li Chung continued. He explained that returning midway after running away was far harder than standing firm from the beginning. It was something only possible when one admitted their mistake and chose to fulfill their duty regardless. He said that only a fool would believe one could never run. Running was not weakness. What mattered was returning. He told Mujin to feel free to run if he needed, but to always return to where he was needed. At the final moment, what mattered was that he had not turned a blind eye to responsibility. Mujin stood frozen, taken aback by the words of his master. Li Chung tilted his head and asked with mock playfulness if he had taught him too many secrets of life. But before he could continue, Mujin tilted back his head and swallowed the black peony flower in one gulp. Li Chung's eyes widened, and his voice cracked in disbelief as he asked if Mujin had really just eaten it. Mujin casually responded that he had, asking why it was a problem. Li Chung exploded in anger, yelling that he had no idea why the hell Mujin would eat it now. Mujin flinched and shouted back that he thought Li Chung wanted him to consume it immediately. He reminded him that he had said there would not be any side effects. But before he could continue, his vision blurred. His body convulsed, and he fell to his knees in agony, crying out in pain. Later, as they walked back toward the village, Mujin staggered, drenched in sweat. Li Chung shook his head and grumbled that only an idiot would eat a cultivating medicine without knowing the proper cultivation technique. Mujin groaned. He insisted that Li Chung had not warned him, and claimed he thought he was supposed to eat it right away. Li Chung sighed and ordered him to perform the black tortoise cultivation method properly. He told him to take the proper steps, breathe correctly, and move his qi exactly as he had been instructed. He scolded him for making his elders do all the hard work. Mujin's voice shook as he admitted that he could not remember how to do it and begged Li Chung to show him one more time. Li Chung scowled and muttered that Mujin was smart but acted like a fool. He repeated the technique carefully, explaining that he needed to cycle his qi through the spleen meridian pathway as he walked. He had to ensure that his entire foot touched the ground, and do it slowly, interweaving the qi entering from the ground with the qi entering from his lungs. The goal was to create a central flow to bind the stomach, spine, and lower body's core together. Once the central axis of the black tortoise cultivation method was operating, The QE within the black peony flower would respond. It had to be done very slowly, he reminded. Mujin gritted his teeth and shouted that he was doing it properly. Li Chung snapped at him to shut up and focus. Little by little, Mujin's breathing calmed and his steps steadied. His qi began to circulate as intended. Li Chung glanced at him, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. In his heart, he thought that Mujin would finish organizing the qi before they arrived at the village, and if taught properly, he might even surpass expectations. Mujin suddenly gasped in awe. He cried out that he could feel the immense qi of the black peony flower within him. Li Chung immediately snapped, yelling that he had barely scratched the surface. He told him that it would take time to truly make the qi his own, and ordered him to use the black tortoise cultivation method whenever possible. Mujin nodded quickly, calming himself. Li Chung then instructed him to drag one of the bodies. Mujin grimaced, clutched his stomach, and whined that it still hurt. When they finally arrived at the village, Mujin explained everything that had happened. He assured the villagers that the disease would now disappear, and that consuming the medicinal brew he prepared would let them recover within 3 days. He added that Red Beggar and Hemp Harvest Beggar had already dealt with the culprits. The villagers erupted in applause, but Jusan remained silent. He stood apart, his lips pressed tightly together, as he carried the lifeless body of his master, Hongyun, on his back. Li Chung noticed his expression and gave him a long look. From a distance, Jusan bowed respectfully toward him, before turning away. Several days later, Mujin sat outside, brewing medicine while practicing martial arts as he waited. He paused, gripping his wooden stick, and wondered aloud how his master had done it. Li Chung appeared suddenly and kicked the back of his knee, forcing him to collapse to the ground. He scolded him for risking getting dust in the medicine and asked mockingly if this was how he planned to prove that he wanted to learn the sword. He told him to pack his bags because they had a long way to go. Mujin scrambled up, bewildered. He protested, asking why they could not stay a few more days since there were still patients. Inwardly, he thought about how nice it would be to enjoy the hero's treatment a little longer. Li Chung dismissed the idea. He reminded him that they had never planned to come to Jewel Village in the first place, and had only stopped because Red Beggar had asked. Mujin blinked in realization and suddenly asked if Li Chung had seen where Red Beggar had gone. Li Chung shrugged and said he had probably given Hemp Harvest Beggar a burial and was now starving somewhere. Mujin's eyes widened, and he exclaimed that it was unacceptable, since Red Beggar was a hero who had saved the village. Li Chung only replied that it was common for members of the beggar's sect who had killed someone. No matter if it was just or unjust, once a beggar killed a martial artist, they were no longer begging. Mujin lowered his gaze and finished his thought quietly. He said that they became a threat. He then asked what Red Beggar would do now. Li Chung said that he would have to make his own choice. That was what it meant to take someone's life. As they departed, the villagers waved to them in gratitude. Their journey led them to a graveyard. Mujin slowed his steps and whispered in surprise that they had arrived at such a place. Li Chung pointed to a particular grave and told him to pay his respects. They approached together. It was the grave of Elder Hongyun. Mujin turned his head and noticed someone standing nearby. His eyes widened when he recognized Hong Jusan. He called out to him with joy, naming him Red Beggar. Jusan greeted them with a faint smile. He admitted that he owed the two of them a great favor and wished them well on their journey. Mujin rushed over, asking if he had been there since last night. He noticed his frail state and quickly offered him food, telling him to eat. Jusan hesitated but accepted with gratitude. Mujin asked if he planned to stay in Jewel Village. Jusan nodded and said he must, since he had lived there all his life and had nowhere else to go. He reassured him that beggars knew how to survive, no matter what. Mujin frowned, recalling his master's words about beggars. Then he looked Jusan in the eye and told him to come with them. Jusan blinked in shock and asked where they were going. Mujin grinned and replied that it would be to a place where he could be a beggar without worrying about how others saw him. He added that Hemp Harvest Beggar would have wished the same for him. He turned to Li Chung and asked if he agreed. But to his surprise, Li Chung was already gone. Mujin grabbed Jusan's hand and pulled him along, yelling for his master to wait up. He said Li Chung could not leave without them. When they finally caught up, Mujin complained under his breath about how impatient he was. Li Chung only smirked in response. Mujin grinned and announced that Red Beggar would be coming with them, asking if it was all right. Li Cheng told him to focus on his black tortoise cultivation method instead. Mujin immediately added that he wanted to learn the sword as well. Li Cheng raised a brow and said he had been wondering when he would finally ask. Jusan, still uncertain, asked where they were headed. Li Cheng chuckled and asked sarcastically if he was a genius, since Mujin had never once asked that question. Jusan tilted his head and said it was only common sense. Mujin crossed his arms with a huff and asked the question again. Where were they going? Li Cheng turned to face them and answered. Their destination was Luoyang. A few days later, somewhere else, Li Cheng began teaching both Tang Mujin and Hong Jusan the sword. He explained with a calm yet commanding tone that the technique he was passing on was called the heart-piercing sword. He admitted that the name was rather bland, but its purpose was close to what a sword should always seek to achieve. He emphasized that among its various movements, there were 3 forms that truly highlighted its purpose. These forms were wasp, ivy vines, and apex. After laying out their importance, he looked at 2 of them and asked if they thought they could manage to learn them. Both Mujin and Jusan wore blank expressions, their faces showing neither excitement nor confidence. Suddenly, Mujin burst out in frustration, shouting how he could possibly be expected to do something so difficult. He demanded if Li Cheng really thought he could just copy whatever he demonstrated. The complaint quickly escalated into an argument between master and disciple. Li Cheng snapped back, questioning why not, reminding Mujin that he had already been teaching him for an entire month. Mujin retorted angrily, asking how he was supposed to destroy a tree in just 1 month. Li Cheng shot back with irritation, asking when he ever said anything about destroying a tree, clarifying that he was only talking about mastering the form, not pointless destruction. As the 2 argued back and forth, Jusan stood nearby with a drained expression. Li Cheng grew impatient and called Jusan over, telling him to give it a try instead. Mujin shouted back insistently that he was doing it correctly, though he could not tell what was wrong. Jusan demonstrated the form as instructed, and Li Cheng immediately praised him, saying that was exactly how it should be done. Mujin, feeling defeated, muttered that he still could not see the difference. Li Cheng urged him to try again. Jusan watched them with a faint smile, quietly observing their dynamic. Mujin grumbled that Li Cheng was asking too much of him when he had only been taught for a month, warning that his master might end up in black thread hell for being so harsh. Li Cheng mocked him in return, telling him to respect his elders unless he wanted to end up in icy hell. As Jusan continued observing, he thought back on the past month. Every morning, they practiced the rat palm strike. In the afternoon, they only used the purple cloud step to improve their movement. By evening, when the sun set, they sparred with the heart-piercing sword. That had been their daily routine for an entire month. Jusan reflected that their relationship was strange. Sometimes they looked like a proper master and disciple. Other times they resembled an uncle and his mischievous nephew, teasing and bickering in any way possible. Yet beneath the humor, he could clearly see the respect and expectations they held for one another. It reminded him of the time when he too once had a master like that. After some time, they arrived at Chongqing. At the city's entrance, Jusan bowed deeply to Li Cheng and Mujin. He expressed his gratitude, saying he had received great help from them until now. Li Cheng replied calmly that fate would determine if they met again. He advised Jusan to change his name if he wished to settle in Chongqing, because if anyone discovered what had happened in Jewel Village, it would cause serious complications. He reminded Jusan that, no matter the reason, he had still committed murder. Jusan bowed again with respect before walking away. He turned back one last time, waving his hand with a faint smile. Mujin waved back and asked aloud if he was really leaving just like that. Li Cheng noted that Mujin looked disappointed. Mujin admitted he was, explaining that Jusan had been his first real friend since leaving Sichuan. Li Cheng teased him, suggesting it was because Mujin had never beaten Jusan in a duel. He mocked further, saying he himself would be mad if he were in that position, warning that Mujin might never be able to defeat him in his entire life. Mujin yelled back that he had almost won during their last duel, but before he could finish complaining, Li Cheng had already disappeared from his side. Mujin looked around, confused and shouting for his master, asking where they were going. Li Cheng simply told him to shut up and follow. Their path eventually led them to the Feng family blacksmith. At the shop, the blacksmith looked at them in surprise when Li Cheng asked to borrow the forge. The blacksmith said his payment would be the right to watch Mujin work. Mujin bowed with a forced smile, pretending to be agreeable, while inwardly gritting his teeth. Li Chung insisted that the blacksmith would be getting front-row seats to the best smithing in the land. Mujin whispered in irritation, asking who would ever agree to such a ridiculous offer. To his surprise, the blacksmith paused, thought for a moment, and then agreed. Mujin's eyes widened in disbelief as he wondered how that had actually worked. Without hesitation, Li Chung shoved Mujin toward the furnace and asked the blacksmith if they could borrow some materials and firewood as well. The blacksmith sighed and agreed, but told Mujin to make him a small scythe in return. Li Chung accepted the request cheerfully, calling the blacksmith, "Good sir." Mujin clenched his teeth, annoyed, and demanded why he had to make a sword all of a sudden, and why he was being treated like some kind of circus attraction. Li Chung scolded him to stop grumbling and make the scythe first, reminding him that their deal had always been that Mujin would repay him with items in exchange for his teachings in medicine and martial arts. He asked Mujin if he had any intention of paying him back for an entire month of instruction. Mujin hesitated and admitted that Li Chung had a point, though he reminded him nervously that he had never made a scythe before. Mujin began forging, and soon the furnace roared to life. The blacksmith, sitting outside in the rain, remarked that it had been a long time since he had done anything with fire. He said it should keep the gods of the forge pleased. As the rhythmic hammering echoed, his eyes widened in shock. He muttered that the hammering sounded like an incantation, blending perfectly with the sound of the rain. He confessed that he did not know if this young man would become the greatest smith under the heavens, but he was certain Mujin would one day grow into a fine one. He compared the boy's progress to himself at that same age, and shook his head in awe. When Mujin finally finished the scythe, the blacksmith's eyes widened again in disbelief. He muttered to himself that this was beyond anything he expected. Mujin apologized, explaining that since he had never made a scythe before, he was unsure if it was made properly. The blacksmith, still stunned, asked if this was really Mujin's first time. Mujin asked if it would suffice as payment. The blacksmith grabbed the scythe immediately and swung it down onto a bamboo table. The blade cut through it smoothly without resistance. Mujin gasped in shock and asked if the man was actually a martial master. Without answering, the blacksmith ran off, leaving Mujin to call out after him in confusion. Li Chung, standing nearby, remained unfazed and told Mujin not to worry, saying they needed to get ready to forge a sword. He added that the crowd would be arriving soon. Then he corrected himself and said they were already there. Right as he finished speaking, a group of people suddenly appeared behind Mujin, their eyes gleaming with curiosity. They demanded to know how he had created such a weapon. Mujin stammered, unable to answer. They exclaimed that the scythe could slice through weapons forged by the best smiths of Chongqing, without the blade chipping even once. They said it was like cutting through tofu. One after another they begged him to teach them his skills. Some demanded that he make a sword first. Others insisted he forge an axe. Their voices piled up until Mujin was overwhelmed. At that moment, Li Chung stepped forward with a sly smile and declared that watching would cost 2 silver ingots. The men all repeated the price in unison, and Li Chung added that Mujin would now be forging a sword. In excitement, they all shouted together, pulling out their silver and thrusting it forward, shouting that they would gladly pay. Meanwhile, Jusan wandered the streets in the middle of the rain. He looked around with thoughtful eyes and reflected that this was his master's hometown. Just as his master had said, everything here was large and bustling. He wondered where the hemp fields were, the ones his master had so often talked about. Then, in the distance, he noticed a group of beggars taking shelter beneath the bridge. His eyes immediately caught on their familiar appearance, and he realized they were members of the beggars' sect. He reached for his knotted rope and smiled, remembering his late master with fondness. In his heart, he resolved to seek out someone in this place who might have known his master. Hong Jusan approached a nearby tavern to ask for information. After receiving what he needed, he bowed respectfully and thanked the tavern owner. The owner welcomed him warmly, saying that disciples of the beggars' sect were always invited to visit any time. As Jusan walked away, he thought to himself that the beggars' sect was indeed on Tavern Street, just as he had heard. But strangely, nobody seemed to know about his master. He wondered if perhaps it was because 20 years had already passed. The beggars' sect here seemed completely different from what his master had described. The fact that even a tavern owner could be a member of the beggars' sect confused him deeply. He recalled the conversation he had just had with the tavern owner, who had explained that in Chongqing, anyone wishing to become a member of the beggars' sect needed to pay an entry fee. It was said to be easily obtainable as long as one worked for it. Jusan frowned at the thought. Even if this was a secular branch, to think that money was required to become a beggar felt absurd. He doubted anyone here would truly know his master. Later, he approached a group of beggars resting under a bridge. He asked them if they had ever heard of a beggar known as the hemp harvest beggar, a four-knotted member of the beggars' sect who had lived in Chongqing about 20 years ago. But all of them shook their heads. Jusan thanked them politely before walking away. As he glanced down at the knotted rope in his hands, he wondered in despair if there really was nobody left who knew. Just then, an old beggar came rushing beneath the bridge to take shelter from the cold rain, muttering about how freezing it was. Jusan hesitated, then thought to himself that perhaps he should ask this man before giving up entirely. He approached and asked the old beggar directly if he knew of the hemp harvest beggar, explaining that he had been a four-knot member of the beggars' sect who had lived in Chongqing about 20 years ago. The old man tilted his head, repeating the name with uncertainty. He asked if the man Jusan spoke of had been about 10 years older than him. Jusan's heart leapt and he shouted excitedly that, yes, that was him. The old man asked if he was referring to the good-looking beggar who had always been out in the hemp fields. Jusan grew even more excited, confirming eagerly that this was indeed the one. But then, the old beggar shook his head and said, Jusan must be mistaken. The hemp harvest beggar had only ever been a one-knot beggar. Jusan froze in shock and disbelief. The old man continued speaking, explaining that the man could never make it past 2 knots. To reach 3 knots required martial arts, and the hemp harvest beggar had never learned any. He had never managed to find a master because he had been sluggish and lazy. Instead, he spent his days in the hemp fields, which earned him the nickname Hemp Harvest Beggar. The old beggar remembered something else as well. When he had been around Jusan's age, some beggars had come searching for the hemp harvest beggar. Apparently, the man had stolen something important and fled. The old beggar added that Granny Yong, who lived downstream, might know more about it, and suggested that Jusan go see her. Tears ran down Jusan's face as he turned and ran through the heavy rain. He recalled the old beggar's words echoing in his mind. Finally, he collapsed to his knees on the soaked ground as thunder cracked across the sky. Holding up the knotted rope, he screamed in anguish, cursing aloud. He shouted, "Fuck you! Damn it!" In a frenzy, he began tearing at the knots with his hands and then with his teeth, screaming again, "Fuck!" He became hysterical, cursing the pathetic beggar he had once called master. He shouted that his master had deserved to die. He raged that the man had given him a knot simply for withstanding hunger, and another knot for recovering from a fever. Jusan threw both his own knot and his master's knot to the ground in disgust. He sneered bitterly, saying that it was no wonder the man's bare-handed martial arts and staff techniques had been so shitty. Then he picked the knots back up, clutching them tightly. His voice broke as he cried out, "Fuck!" Raising his head to the storming sky, he yelled at the top of his lungs that his master had been a liar. Everything had been a lie. Nothing had been true. He cursed him again and again, declaring that he had died like a dog. His voice cracked with grief and fury as he shouted, "Fuck! Motherfucker!" He called himself an idiot for ever believing in such lies, screaming that he was a fucking idiot. He held the knots high above his head while staring at the river before him. After a long pause, he dropped back to his knees, still clutching the knots. He curled in on himself, sobbing. Through his tears, he whispered that his master had not been a guardian, had not been anything at all, and now he could not even question him because he was already dead. He cursed again through his cries, then slowly placed the knots beneath the water, letting them slip from his grasp. Thunder struck nearby as he curled up even tighter, crying harder than before. Meanwhile, at the Feng family blacksmith, Tang Mujin had just finished forging a sword. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he announced that he would stop for the day. The men watching protested loudly, asking why he was stopping so soon. The blacksmith shop's owner quickly calmed them down, saying Mujin needed his rest. Another man agreed, though he asked if he could at least get some advice about flame management. But another blacksmith reminded him that he could not push Mujin like that while Yi Cheng was not present. The man relented, saying he had not meant to be pushy. At that moment, Mujin noticed Jusan entering the shop. Jusan's eyes were swollen and tired from crying, though he forced a smile when Mujin called out to him. When Jusan explained everything that had just happened, Mujin grew quiet. After a moment of silence, Mujin repeated the name Hemp Harvest Beggar, then sighed heavily. He asked Jusan if he had eaten yet, acknowledging how he must be feeling. Jusan replied that he had not, but So-sun had given him some food earlier. Mujin blinked in surprise and asked who So-sun was. Jusan explained that she was a girl who lived under the same bridge as him. He admitted that he had not been planning to eat, but could not bring himself to refuse food when a fellow beggar offered it. Mujin immediately smacked Jusan on the back, scolding him furiously. He called him an idiot for accepting food from a little girl. He reminded him that he was no longer a member of the beggars sect, and yet he still took food from a beggar girl. Jusan stammered in protest, saying he had not taken it from her. Mujin ignored him and declared that they were going out. When Jusan asked where, Mujin answered sharply that they were going to get the beggar grime out of him. Later that night, the two of them sat in a grand tavern. Music and laughter filled the hall, and the lively atmosphere carried through the air. Jusan, now dressed in new clothes, ate and drank with Mujin at his side. Mujin drank happily and roared Jusan's name, raising his cup. He challenged Jusan to eat until they died. Downing a gulp of hot wine, Mujin roared loudly again as the burn hit him. The musician in the center of the room scowled and muttered about the noisy brat disturbing his performance. Mujin ignored him, laughing loudly and praising how good the food and drink tasted. Jusan chuckled at him, teasing that he had looked like he was about to vomit. Mujin puffed out his chest proudly and mocked his own master, boasting that he had not received the title of one of the greatest physicians under the heavens through gambling. Jusan laughed at the remark and warned him that he would get in trouble if Mr. Lee heard him say that. Mujin brushed it off with a laugh, saying Mr. Lee was away at the moment. He warned Jusan that if he left any food behind, he would be struck in the chest with a rat palm strike. Jusan laughed again, and Mujin told him to just drink. The night continued with the two of them eating and drinking until their bellies were near bursting. Both wore wide smiles of satisfaction. Eventually, Jusan leaned back and admitted he could not eat anymore. Mujin agreed with a chuckle. Jusan asked how payment worked, confessing that he had never paid for anything in his life since he had lived as a beggar. Mujin burst into laughter and explained mockingly that you paid with money, calling him a fucking beggar. Jusan laughed too, but then asked how much it would cost since he had no money. Mujin admitted that he had no money either. The two chuckled at their shared poverty, but suddenly realization hit Jusan. He jumped to his feet and slammed the table, shocking everyone around him as he shouted in alarm. He demanded to know what they were going to do, crying out that they had no money. He scolded Mujin, asking what he had been thinking, since the beggars' sect ran the tavern. Mujin, drunk and swaying, only smirked and said so what. He declared boldly that he was one of the three greatest physicians under the heavens, the eccentric physician Li Chung. Jusan panicked and begged him to stop messing around. Mujin cleared his throat and declared that someone like him need not worry about such things. He burst into loud, booming laughter that echoed through the tavern. In an instant, Mujin disappeared from his seat and reappeared behind the musician. Smiling widely, he held a bottle of liquor in one hand and pulled a knife from his sleeve with the other. As Mujin raised his knife, the musician became alarmed. Without warning, Mujin slashed the blade toward the wooden wall. Jusan immediately yelled in shock, demanding to know what he was doing. The people around them burst into laughter, mistaking his actions for drunken antics. They shouted that the young lad was really drunk and urged him to keep going. One of the attendants called out in panic, asking Mujin what he was doing and shouting "Sir" repeatedly. Mujin slowly turned his gaze toward the attendant with a chilling glare. Terrified, the attendant cried for the guards to hurry and do something. Mujin smirked darkly and continued to strike the wooden wall with his knife. When the guards arrived, one of them shouted at him, demanding to know who he thought he was and ordering him to get down immediately, insisting he could not cause such a drunken scene there. Mujin ignored the warnings and continued with his actions. The guard yelled again, asking what he thought he was doing. Mujin replied slowly, asking what else it could be, before throwing liquor against the wall to reveal what he had been carving all along. Everyone gasped in surprise at the sight of the beautiful carving. Mujin took a swig from the liquor bottle and stated that he was in the middle of paying and asked if he should stop. Stunned by the sight of the masterpiece, the guard stammered that he was only asking because the music had stopped. He then turned toward the musician and shouted for him to keep playing, saying they could not interrupt Mujin's mood. The musician, clearly annoyed, reluctantly began to play again. The tavern patrons looked on in amazement as Mujin continued carving the wooden wall. After some time, a majestic Buddha statue emerged from the wood. Mujin declared that he would pay his bill for the day with that piece of art. Inwardly, Mujin recalled his master's words. His master had told him that with such skills, countless people would be eager to offer him gratitude wherever he went. Just as his master had said, the effects of the thousand-handed Buddha were extraordinary. Soon, people rushed toward Mujin, offering him riches and begging for him to come to their taverns. One pleaded for him to visit that night, promising that they had butchered a whole young lamb just for him. Mujin smirked at Jusan and modestly claimed it was only a doodle. From that point on, the two of them traveled from tavern to tavern, leaving behind carvings of masterpieces for each establishment. In one tavern, Mujin carved a dragon that left the tavern owner stunned. The man marveled aloud at how such a masterpiece could be completed in just 2 hours. In another tavern, they were offered a mountain of pork dumplings as advance payment. Later, Jusan and Mujin gave the dumplings to the beggars beneath the bridge. Jusan handed food to So-sun, telling him to eat well. So-sun smiled gratefully and thanked him, calling him a hero. Mujin watched from a distance and sighed, thinking to himself that Jusan was finally smiling properly. Later that day, Mujin and Jusan lay inside their room, recovering. Jusan asked if they would be visiting the tavern again that day. Mujin groaned, complaining that he was too hungover, and that they had been at it for too many days in a row. He said he wanted the day off and asked Jusan why he wanted to go. Jusan laughed it off, saying he was only asking because it had been raining too much. Mujin laughed along and agreed. Suddenly, a voice called Jusan's name from outside. Jusan looked out the window and saw So-samgu. Mujin recognized him and muttered his name. Samgu shouted up that So-sun had gone missing. Jusan's eyes widened in alarm, and he repeated the words in disbelief. Samgu explained that So-sun always told them where she was going when she ventured out and never wandered far on rainy days. He said the river bandits must have taken her. Shocked, Jusan asked if he was certain. Samgu explained that children had been disappearing from time to time. At first, everyone assumed they had been washed away, but several witnesses had seen the river bandits abducting children. He added that he had heard unorthodox martial artists purchase children for horrendous purposes. He feared that if So-sun had been captured for such a reason, she might have already been harmed. Jusan placed a hand on Samgu's shoulder and reassured him. He promised to look into it and said he knew someone who could help. He told Samgu not to worry and to hold on a little longer. Grateful, Samgu thanked him. Jusan then went to a tavern where the owner was a member of the beggar sect. He explained the situation, and the tavern owner said he would ask his superiors, but warned Jusan not to expect much. Stunned, Jusan asked what he meant. He argued that as members of the beggar sect, they should act. The tavern owner admitted they must act, but explained that they could not launch an all-out confrontation with the river bandits without solid proof of kidnapping. He added that the timing was dire. Confused, Jusan asked what he meant by season. The tavern owner pointed out that since Jusan was not from the area, he would not know. He explained that the rainy spring season was when every beggar sect member in Chongqing was on high alert. This year, the rainfall was even worse than the last. He pointed out the window, showing the rising waters. He said if the rain continued for a day or two longer, the Yangtze River would undoubtedly flood. He explained that flooding often caused homes to be lost, and deaths were common. To prevent such casualties, the beggar sect was devoting its manpower to stacking barricades, leaving them unable to investigate the bandits. He repeated that he would ask the higher-ups but gave no promises. Later, under the bridge, Jusan relayed what the tavern owner had told him. Samgu grew furious and asked how they could believe such words. He said the beggar sect treated them like animals because they were not members and could not be trusted. Jusan tried to calm him, but Samgu raged that the sect would indeed stack barricades, but only in places where wealthy people lived, with no regard for beggars. He asked bitterly how they could rely on them. Jusan weakly insisted that as martial artists, they should have some sense of justice. Samgu broke into tears, shouting that the river bandits, unorthodox sects, and demonic criminals were all martial artists as well, and none of them had justice. He said in the past decade, there had never been a confrontation between the beggar sect and the river bandits. He argued that they would never risk their lives for a beggar, that they only cared about maintaining their image and status. Jusan recalled the words of his master and the old beggar, who had told him it was time to repay the people for their food, and that he could never surpass 2 knots. Anger filled him, and he clenched his lips. He thought to himself that it had all been a lie. He told himself there was no need to feel guilty. The other beggars under the bridge tried to calm Samgu, but Jusan's thoughts grew darker. He told himself it was not his duty, and that he owed them nothing. He had done more than enough, and his duty had ended in Jewel Village. He told himself that even that duty had been a lie from a beggar. Opening his umbrella, he turned away. As he walked, he passed another beggar wearing a straw hat and cloak. The beggar called out to him, asking if he was the one searching for the hemp harvest beggar. She introduced herself as Granny Yang and asked what relationship he had with Zhang Gyun. Hearing the name filled Jusan with rage. He thought bitterly that even the name had been a lie. He asked her what about him, adding that he had heard Zhang Gyun was a petty thief who ran away, and asked if he had stolen something from her. Granny Yang shook her head and said he was not the type to steal. She paused and said perhaps he had stolen a person. Shocked, Jusan repeated her words. She explained that about 20 years earlier, there had been an internal conflict within the beggar sect between the secular and traditional factions. She said the red-faced old beggar of the secular faction was now vice leader of the headquarters. But at the time, the Willow Hill beggar of the traditional faction had held that position. She explained that while it might seem trivial whether beggars wore clean or dirty clothes, the growing resentment had boiled over until a fight broke out. During that struggle, the Willow Hill beggar had been killed, and the conflict forced the traditional faction out of Chongqing. She said that was the day the hemp harvest beggar fled with the Willow Hill beggar's son. Jusan asked what the man's real name had been. Granny Yang answered that his name was Hong Jung. Jusan fell silent. Granny Yang turned away and said that since Jusan did not even know the Willow Hill beggar's name, she doubted he was looking for his son. She said if that was the case, her knowledge ended there. She added that if he did meet the hemp harvest beggar, he should tell him she was doing well, and should come look for her if he ever returned. By the time she fully turned away, Jusan had vanished, leaving only his umbrella behind. After some time, Jusan stood once again before the river. His face was twisted with grief as he muttered to himself that everything had been a lie. He told himself that the man's name, his martial arts, and even the claim that he was a 4-knotted beggar had all been nothing but lies. His voice cracked as he demanded to know why. Tears streamed down his face as he repeated the question over and over. Driven by anguish, he waded into the river and began scrambling through the shallows, desperately searching for the knots he had discarded days before. He muttered again and again that he had to find them. When his hands came up empty, his frustration mounted until he clenched his teeth in fury. After a few moments, his determination hardened. He prepared himself, then dove into the deeper waters. Under the surface, Jusan's mind replayed the memories of his time with Elder Honggyun. He remembered how the 4 knots of the Guardian of Beggar's Mountain were tied as a symbol of duty. They were tied to protect someone. They had been tied to protect him. His inner voice trembled as he called out to his master. He swam deeper, and at last his eyes caught sight of the knots tangled in the water plants. Relief surged through him, but as he reached for them, the plants twisted around his body, entangling his limbs. He struggled frantically, trying to break free and rise to the surface, but the plants held tight. His lungs screamed for air, his breath reached its limit, and his vision began to blur. Just as his consciousness slipped, a strong hand grabbed him. Mujin appeared and pulled him from the water, saving him at the last possible moment. The two collapsed on the riverbank as the clouds parted and the sunlight finally broke through. Both of them gasped for air. Mujin cursed furiously at him, shouting that he must have some impulsive desire to dirty his clothes and calling him an idiot for swimming in such weather. Jusan lay still for a moment, clutching the knots tightly in his hand. Then, in a burst of laughter, he laughed aloud, almost hysterically. After catching his breath, he stood, still gripping the knots as if they were his lifeline. He begged Mujin to help him, just this once. Mujin stared at him in disbelief and shouted that he had just saved his life, demanding what more he wanted. Yusun's expression grew fierce as he cried out that they had to rescue Sosun from the river bandits. Mujin froze in confusion, repeating the words as though they made no sense. He muttered that Jusan should at least ask for an easier favor. Later that day, the rain poured once again over the riverside. People hurried to stack and pile sacks along the riverbank in preparation for the coming flood. From a distance, Jusan and Mujin crouched behind a rock, their clothes soaked and their bodies shivering. Mujin grumbled bitterly that Jusan could not have chosen an easier task. Jusan gave no reply. Mujin finally asked if he had a plan. Jusan casually admitted that he did not. Mujin nearly exploded, demanding to know if he intended to take on all the bandits by himself. Jusan shook his head and said that was impossible. Instead, he explained that they only needed to find where So-sun was being held and get her out. Mujin sighed in frustration, but agreed that locating her came first. Jusan pointed toward the cluster of structures by the riverside and insisted that she had to be inside one of them. He said they had no choice but to sneak in. Mujin snapped at him, calling him an idiot, and pointing out that his clothes stood out far too much to pass unnoticed. Jusan suggested rubbing dirt on themselves as camouflage, but Mujin spat back that it would never work. Jusan then half-seriously proposed that they strip. Mujin could only gape at him in disbelief. Before he could answer, their conversation was cut short by the sound of footsteps and voices nearby. They turned and saw two men walking side by side, speaking to one another. One of the men cursed and complained that he would rather be working on the flood barrier than patrolling in the pouring rain. The other replied that being scolded by their leader was worse. Startled, Jusan and Mujin immediately ducked behind a large rock beside a wooden bridge. Both muttered under their breath that they were fucked. Mujin's eyes followed the two approaching men carefully. He thought to himself in alarm that the river bandits actually had organized patrol teams, and he knew that fighting here would be a terrible idea. His body trembled from the tension. He told himself they only needed to wait for the patrol to pass. The footsteps grew louder as the two bandits approached the wooden bridge. The tension in Mujin's chest rose with every step. He realized they would be spotted for sure if they stayed where they were. He considered diving under the bridge, but it was too small to fit both of them. At that moment, Jusan moved quickly under the bridge and used hand signals to direct Mujin. Mujin, surprised by how clear the signals were, understood them immediately. He realized the plan was for him to stay hidden behind the rock while Jusan remained beneath the bridge. Mujin nodded to confirm. He reassured himself that the sound of the rain would cover any noise, and he even admitted inwardly that Jusan could be unexpectedly clever in situations like this. The two river bandits crossed the wooden bridge. Mujin pressed himself tightly against the rock, perfectly concealed. At a distance, Jusan gave him a nod and a thumbs up. Mujin smiled faintly and returned the gesture. He thought to himself with relief that it was going smoothly, and even chuckled at how easy sneaking in was turning out to be. But before the two bandits could completely cross the bridge, Jusan suddenly vanished from his hiding place. Mujin's eyes widened in shock, and cold sweat dripped down his forehead. Then, a loud voice rang out. Jusan shouted the name of a technique as he lunged forward. He struck with his staff at the two bandits, aiming to take them both down. The bandits reacted quickly and dodged the attack with sharp instincts. Mujin immediately rushed in to support him. Jusan trembled in disbelief, his expression frozen in shock. He muttered that the staff technique was supposed to hit both targets for the plan to work. The two bandits glared at him with menacing eyes, ready to counterattack. From the distance, Mujin looked at Jusan with exasperation and muttered under his breath, calling him a retard. The river bandit growled fiercely in Jusan's face, demanding to know why he was blocking an elder's path. He shouted that if Jusan did not move, he would poke a hole straight through his skull. Jusan was still stunned, unable to reply, staring blankly at the man as his words faltered. Before the bandit could act, Mujin drew his sword and yelled loudly for Jusan to snap out of it and get up, calling him an idiot. The river bandit noticed Mujin and barked angrily, realizing another one had been lying in wait. He mocked them both as arrogant brats. Then the bandit lunged at Mujin, shouting that he was still wet behind the ears and that he would finish him. Mujin's heart pounded in fear. In his mind, he admitted it felt as if he were running straight towards a cliff, but he reminded himself he could not back down. As he tried to gather his resolve, he recalled his master's teachings. He remembered Li Cheng's voice instructing him to read the Turo. Turo was a horizontal slash, a wide swing that carved open empty space. His master had told him to lower his stance, to dive in, and to use 3 feints by raising the blade vertically. When the opponent faltered, he was to aim straight for the heart. As the river bandit closed the distance, Mujin prayed silently that everything would go just as planned. He struck the first feint, his blade swinging, while the bandit slashed horizontally. Mujin ducked lower and then drove his sword upward. The blade pierced through the straw hat and into the bandit's neck. Mujin froze in shock, unable to believe what he had just done. His body shook uncontrollably. As the bandit collapsed, his final word left his lips. He called out a master before dying. Later Yusan called out to him, pointing out that there was still blood on his face. Mujin, still in a daze, wiped it away and muttered a distracted thanks. Soon after, the two of them crouched in the corner near the riverside houses, wearing the straw hats and cloaks of the bandits they had killed. Jusan reasoned that nobody would be around since most of them were building embankments. He insisted that while the river bandits were busy, they needed to check every house one by one. He hoped they would not all come pouring out at once. Mujin answered absently, still unfocused, wiping his clothes with his hand. Jusan tapped his shoulder and scolded him, telling him to focus. He warned that if Mujin failed to act at the right moment again, it would all be over. Mujin retorted that Jusan was the one who did not even know what infiltrate meant. He told him that if he had truly meant to infiltrate, he would have kept his mouth shut and waited quietly in hiding earlier. Jusan stammered, trying to defend himself, then shifted the blame by saying Mujin had failed to read his hand signals. Mujin accused him of changing the subject, but Jusan brushed it off, insisting they needed to infiltrate. Mujin sighed and said that from now on, they would keep quiet and move fast. He stressed that they must find So-sun and get out without fighting, and told Jusan to quit shouting the names of sword forms. Jusan replied that he had been taught to shout the form names aloud. Mujin grew irritated and whispered angrily that shouting earlier had caused everyone to scatter. He claimed that they only scraped through because he was a master. Jusan laughed mockingly, doubting Mujin's claim, and teased that he was hardly a master. Mujin insisted that the bandit they had just killed had called him master. Jusan mocked him again, saying the title was given to a man whose hands had been trembling moments ago. Their banter continued as they reached the last building. Crouching in front of the door, Jusan mocked Mujin further, saying he had been beaten down by a child's swordsmanship for a month straight, even after calling out every form name. Mujin shushed him, saying they were infiltrating. Jusan grinned and teased him more, betting that nobody was inside. Mujin called him a beggar and said he did not even have money to bet with. Jusan accused Mujin of mocking the poor without decency, but Mujin brushed it off with a laugh. They slowly opened the door, and Jusan smugly began to say he had been right, until his words cut off. Inside, they saw two river bandits. One of the men stood and greeted them, pretending they were patrolling hard, while another greeted them casually. Mujin and Jusan froze, staring at each other with sweat dripping down their faces. Jusan whispered nervously that there were actually people inside. They quickly closed the door. A sound of a scuffle erupted from within. Moments later, Jusan peeked outside to make sure no one had been alarmed. Then the two of them dragged the unconscious bodies out, tied their hands with rope, and slammed them to the ground nearby the stilted walkway. They pointed their weapons at the bandits and demanded to know where the girl was. Mujin described So-sun's appearance, calling her the little beggar with her hair tied in two bunches who had lived under the bridge. He threatened to put holes in them if they did not talk. One of the river bandits laughed mockingly at them. He taunted that they might know the rules of conduct but had never tried using real threats. He sneered and asked if they thought rolling their eyes at him would be enough to make him reveal where the precious goods were hidden. Raising his voice, he shouted that if they truly wanted to intimidate Zhang Sangche, the captain who had taken more than a dozen lives, they would need to do far better. It would have to be scarier than even the quartermaster's torture. Mujin grew irritated and cursed inwardly. He thought that simply flashing a blade should have been enough to make the man talk, but it had failed. Now he wondered desperately what they should do. Jusan leaned closer and whispered that perhaps there was another way. He explained that the man was clearly only afraid of the quartermaster's torture. Mujin turned his head and whispered back, questioning what Jusan meant by another way. Jusan replied that they obviously could not bring the quartermaster there. An idea suddenly struck Mujin, and his thoughts sharpened. He realized with alarm that he might have to resort to torture. He walked away, leaving Jusan confused. Jusan called out after him in a hushed but urgent voice, demanding to know what he was doing. As Mujin stepped aside, he slipped a small packet from his pocket. In his mind, he identified it immediately. It was the emergency aconite he had prepared. He reminded himself that aconite was often used for pain relief, but it was also a deadly poison, the infamous root of wolfsbane. Mixed with ligusticum, romania, and ginger, it promoted circulation and could take effect rapidly. He admitted to himself that he did not want to torture anyone, nor did he even know how. He scooped rainwater into his hand and told himself that just enough of the concoction would be enough to make the bandit believe it was poison. Determined, he began mixing the herbs with the aconite. His thoughts hardened as he whispered inwardly that it only needed to frighten the man stiff. He prayed silently for the ruse to work. Once the mixture was ready, Mujin returned. As he approached, Jiang Sangche stared at him nervously and asked what he was doing. Mujin replied coldly, asking if the captain really wanted to know. With deliberate slowness, he raised a needle and pointed it toward Sangche's face. Sangche's eyes widened in disbelief as he muttered that it was a needle. Mujin's presence turned chilling. He told him that since he feared the quartermaster's torture above all else, he might as well test his. Mujin declared that everyone who had ever been struck with this needle had felt the blood vessels in their limbs tear apart in unbearable agony before death. He said it hurt much worse than being pierced with a sword, and even added that the patrolling bandit they had killed earlier had died in that exact way. Leaning closer, he asked if the man wanted to talk. He held the needle only an inch away from Sangchai's eye. The captain tried to act tough, laughing nervously and accusing Mujin of bluffing. He insisted that a mere sword user would never know poison techniques. Mujin snapped back, shouting for him to see for himself whether it was a bluff. Inside, however, his mind was racing. He cursed under his breath, realizing that the captain was actually forcing him to go through with it. He had not measured the dosage, so even he did not know how the poison would work. If it was too weak, Sangchai would just shut his mouth tighter, and Mujin would be completely ruined. With no other choice, Mujin jabbed the needle into Jiang Sangchai's chest. Sangchai trembled violently, trying to brush it off and muttering that nothing was happening. Then, in an instant, blood spewed from his mouth. The other river bandit screamed in terror, calling out desperately to his captain. Sangchai's body convulsed uncontrollably, until finally, after several moments, he collapsed, lifeless on the ground. Mujin froze in shock. His eyes went wide, and he muttered in disbelief that the man was dead. The remaining bandits stared at his fallen captain, his entire body shaking. Mujin seized him by the neck and glared into his eyes with a terrifying presence. He told him that if he thought it was not a bluff either, then he had better speak properly. He demanded to know where the girl was. The bandit broke down completely. With a trembling voice, he confessed that she was inside the cave. As Mujin and Jusan made their way toward the cave, Mujin's thoughts weighed heavily on his mind. He reflected on his actions, one life taken with a sword, another taken through medicine. He told himself that he had killed 2 people. When they arrived outside the cave, Mujin grabbed a torch from nearby, and together they pressed deeper inside. His inner thoughts continued to haunt him. He had killed one man with a sword to save Jusan, and another with medicine to save So-sun. He justified it to himself, saying he had no choice. One killing was intentional, the other a mistake, but he still questioned whether it had truly been a mistake. The silence was broken when Jusan glanced at him and hesitantly asked about the man with the scars, wondering if Mujin had messed up. Mujin paused, trembling, before answering defensively. He snapped that the man had admitted himself to killing over 10 people, and such a man deserved death. He confessed that it might have been a mistake, but he did not regret it. He urged Jusan to focus on finding So-sun so they could leave quickly, saying the rain had already soured his mood. Jusan fell behind slightly, staring at Mujin. In his thoughts, he wondered if he should not have asked for Mujin's help in the first place. Yet he could not turn back now, knowing that because of him, Mujin had done the things he did. Before he could finish his train of thought, their advance was halted by a fork in the cave. Jusan pointed out that there were 2 paths. Mujin studied the right one, and commented that he smelled something foul coming from that direction. Jusan inspected the left path, and said he smelled nothing bad from that side. He suggested that perhaps they should split up, or that Mujin could stand guard while he checked each path one by one. Mujin was about to reply when Jusan suddenly interrupted him. Jusan told him to wait, warning that people were coming. Without hesitation, Jusan lay flat on the ground, pressing his ear against the stone to feel the vibrations. After a moment, his eyes widened. Mujin urgently asked him what he meant by people, and demanded to know how many. With a trembling body, Jusan croaked out that it was all of them. At that moment, footsteps echoed from the distance. Jusan gripped his weapon tightly as he braced himself, asking Mujin what they should do since there was nowhere to hide. Mujin dropped the torch to the ground, drew his sword, and asked what else they could do. As the footsteps grew louder, Mujin's gaze hardened, and he said they would take as many of their enemies with them as possible. His mind raced with panic and calculation. He envisioned himself fighting the bandits and ending up dead, forcing himself to abandon his first plan. Even his imagined scenarios revealed too many openings. He thought quickly about adjusting his approach, deciding to replace the feints of the wasp style with real attacks, leaving cuts that would hinder their opponent's movements. He told himself that he needed to deal with the charge one row at a time, but he knew that if it went on too long, he would be forced backward. If surrounded, it would all be over. He cursed under his breath. The bandits appeared in the distance. Mujin stood frozen and trembling as his thoughts spiraled. He wondered desperately if there was no perfect solution, as in medical texts. There were no lessons written on fighting hordes of men in a cave, and it was not something that could be solved with intuition. He forced himself to inhale deeply, then exhaled, steadying his resolve. Taking his stance, he promised himself that he had no intention of pleading for his life. When the bandits finally drew near, one of them scoffed and mocked them, saying it was just 2 rats. He accused them of daring to break into the Yangtze River stronghold and cutting down their men while they were patrolling and resting. Mujin raised his sword and, with nervous determination, retorted that they would soon hear it from their comrades' mouths. He counted more than 20 men, far more than he had expected. He admitted to himself that he did not know the solution, but he had no choice but to fight. The bandit leader sneered and repeated Mujin's words to the others, telling them to wipe out the intruders before their leader returned. With a chilling grin, he gave the order, and the bandits roared as they charged. Jusan and Mujin braced themselves for the fight. Mujin clenched his lips and gripped his sword tightly. His thoughts sharpened. He had no time for fear. There was only one solution: kill in order to survive. He resolved to cut them down one row at a time. With a cry, he leapt forward, swinging his blade with all his strength. His sword struck 2 men at once, but he cursed himself for losing control and swinging too broadly. Another pair of bandits rushed at him, and he realized there was no way out. If he stopped here, he would die. Suddenly a thunderous roar echoed through the cave. Jusan cried out the name of his attack, Half-Wrecking Claw, and leapt high into the air. His weapon crashed down, cutting down the 2 bandits who had been about to overwhelm Mujin. The remaining bandits cried out in disbelief, shouting that the 2 of them were strong. Now standing side by side with fierce determination, Mujin and Jusan faced their enemies. Jusan turned to him and shouted angrily, asking if he was trying to get himself killed by acting cool. He demanded to know who would help him find So-sun if he died. Hearing his words, Mujin grinned and asked who exactly was dying here. Stepping forward with renewed confidence, he shouted that until Jusan repaid the 5 silver ingots he owed him, he would never allow himself to die. He called Jusan a beggar and told him to remember it. One of the bandits screamed in rage, commanding his men not to give the 2 any time to recover and to keep pressing forward. Another horde surged toward them, and the battle raged on. The sound of weapons clashing and the screams of the fallen echoed through the cave. Mujin and Jusan fought with all their strength, cutting down enemy after enemy. After what felt like endless chaos, the last of the horde collapsed to the ground. Panting heavily, Mujin and Jusan stared at the remaining bandit in front of them with grim smiles. Catching their breath, Mujin's thoughts lit with hope. Perhaps, if they were lucky, they might actually survive this. But their moment of relief was short-lived. Their eyes widened in shock as a towering figure loomed at the back of the bandits. The men in front instantly parted and bowed deeply, crying out in unison that their leader had arrived. Mujin looked up at the figure with horror. His body trembled as he whispered in disbelief, asking what in the hell he was looking at. Before him, the bandit leader stepped into view, glaring down at them with a wide, sinister smirk. The bandit leader crouched down and touched the blood of one of his fallen men. With a dark grin, he muttered that many fools had attempted to raid the Yangtze River stronghold. He raised his finger, tasted the blood, and said that after killing them all, he had grown rather bored with the lack of challengers. Now, however, he had come across rats who actually knew martial arts. He laughed loudly, the sound echoing through the cave. Mujin and Jusan flinched in horror at the roar, and Mujin quickly realized that there was chi hidden in the man's laugh. His mind froze as he judged that the bandit leader was at least a first-rate fighter. Jusan, however, shouted in defiance, telling the man to shut up. He hurled insults, calling him a filthy beggar with an axe who only knew how to talk big. He declared that such a beggar, who had no respect for the proper martial code, deserved nothing more than a beating. With rage, Jusan lunged forward, weapon in hand, and attacked the bandit leader. The bandit leader smirked and, with ease, waved his hand to meet the strike. He taunted Jusan, asking if he truly thought he was that weak, and told him to stop yelling out his moves. Mujin screamed Jusan's name and rushed to support him, but Jusan staggered as his weapon recoiled. Through gritted teeth, Jusan shouted back that whether he called out his moves or not was his own choice. Spinning mid-air, he prepared for another strike. The bandit leader's grin widened. He mocked him again, saying it was indeed his choice, if he wanted to die. With that, the axe swung down, ready to split Jusan apart. Jusan's eyes widened in shock, but before the blow could land, Mujin stepped in. His sword intercepted the swing, diverting it just enough to prevent a killing strike, though the axe still grazed Jusan's shoulder, tearing a piece of cloth. With a scoff, the bandit leader followed with a brutal kick that sent both Mujin and Jusan flying back. Though they landed on their feet, both staggered from the blow. Mujin gritted his teeth, holding back nausea. He thought that the man was nothing compared to his master, but his chi was formidable enough to make him feel sick. He told himself he had to minimize contact and end the fight quickly. The bandit leader, however, laughed with unrestrained joy. He declared how much fun this was and demanded they come at him again. He spread his arms wide, asking who would go first. Mujin's heart pounded as he realized there was no way to end this quickly. He wondered whether he should attack from the left or right, but his thoughts were cut short when the man made the decision for them. With a roar, the bandit leader charged. He swung his axe horizontally with terrifying speed, promising he would take it slow so they could last longer. Mujin bent backward to dodge, his mind racing. If this was him taking it slow, then the gust alone from his swings could peel his skin apart. For such a large man, his speed was monstrous, making his trajectories difficult to read. Yet compared to his master's strikes, Mujin could still follow them. At that moment, Jusan ran along the wall of the cave to gain momentum. He shouted the name of his technique, announcing 4 blows and 9 bows, before hurling himself into the fray. Mujin stared in surprise, muttering to himself, wondering if Jusan felt no fear at all. Jusan attacked, but the bandit leader leapt into the air to dodge. He grabbed Jusan by the back mid-flight, forcing Mujin to rush forward to cover him. Mujin realized grimly that the man was not struggling. He was toying with them. After landing, the bandit leader rammed his knee into Jusan's gut, knocking the air from him. Mujin's thoughts hardened. To this monster, they were nothing but rats in front of a cat. But he reminded himself that he was not just any rat. He was a rat raised by a tiger, and no matter what, he would find a way. If there was no clear solution, he would make one. He would bite and scratch if necessary. Jusan stumbled backward in pain, while the bandit leader turned his focus toward Mujin. The axe came down again and again, and Mujin barely managed to block, studying his opponent's patterns. He noticed that the man's movements were limited to vertical and horizontal swings with no stabbing thrusts. He concluded that an axe was harder to bring upward than a sword, which meant that transitioning from a horizontal strike to a vertical one took longer. If he could bait the leader into raising his arms, then he could aim for his torso. Before he could act on this strategy, Jusan once again rushed in recklessly, screaming out the names of his moves: dog-beating jump smash, and crouching sky leap. Mujin muttered in frustration, telling himself to stop shouting, since Jusan had not landed a single hit, and was only getting beaten up while interfering with his own chances to strike. The bandit leader batted Jusan aside once more, sending him sprawling. Mujin rushed forward in the opening, telling himself they could not last long at this pace. He needed to force an opening, no matter the risk. After a fierce exchange, the bandit leader smirked, and told Mujin that he must be aiming for something. With mocking laughter, he said he would show him an opening himself. Mujin's eyes widened, realizing that the man had read his plan. The axe slammed down, and though Mujin managed to block, the sheer force flung him backward. Jusan charged in again, yelling the name of another move: bold head smash. Mujin steadied himself and stared in disbelief. Jusan was smiling. He realized his companion was bluffing, pretending to have more techniques than he did. Jusan raised his weapon high as though to strike, but at the last second, he let it go and screamed the name of a new move: hemp harvest beggar. The bandit leader froze momentarily, confused, repeating the name in disbelief. Mujin's lips curled into a grin. He too muttered the name, recognizing Jusan's intent. Jusan dove in, only to be kicked brutally in the chin. His body shook, but he did not falter. He clenched his teeth, shoved aside the leader's leg, and darted to the side. At that moment, Mujin seized the chance. He charged forward with his sword raised, while Jusan locked both arms around the leader's right arm, holding him in place. The bandit leader scoffed and laughed, shouting that now he understood the meaning of the strange move name. He praised their audacity and bellowed for them to come at him harder. Straining against Jusan's grip, he tried to swing his axe, but Jusan clung to him with all his strength. Mujin's eyes burned with determination as he closed the distance. He thought to himself that this was the opening Jusan had risked his life to create. Even if he died here, he would make sure the strike connected. He told himself he would leave the rest to the red beggar. With that, he swung his sword in a powerful horizontal arc, aiming directly for the bandit leader's neck. Mujin's strike landed cleanly, severing the bandit leader's head in one decisive blow. The head fell and rolled across the ground toward the remaining bandits. Jusan stared at it with a wide grin, while the others trembled in fear, whispering among themselves that their leader was dead, and wondering if they should flee. One bandit in the front, his body shaking, forced himself to remain steady. He shouted at the others to get a grip, and demanded to know if they intended to let their treasures be taken. He reminded them that their enemies were already exhausted, and ordered them to charge. Mujin, struggling to catch his breath, thought grimly to himself that this man was unfortunately clever. He braced himself for the incoming attack, muttering inwardly that even if he was at his limits, he would endure until the very end. At his side, Jusan pulled out a small container and a set of needles. He dipped them into poison, clenched them between his fingers, and stepped forward. With a loud voice, he announced the name of his move, Heaven Clouding Flower Rain. He then hurled the poisoned needles toward the bandits. Mujin's eyes widened in disbelief, as he thought to himself that this was absurd. Bluffing with names was one thing, but this was pure nonsense. The needles hit a few bandits. Mujin then turns to Jusan, wondering why the man seemed so proud. But then a heavy thud echoed through the cave. 2 bandits struck by the needles collapsed, their bodies convulsing as foam poured from their mouths. Mujin froze, shocked, and asked himself silently if they had simply gotten lucky. Yet even as he wondered, another thought struck him. If luck was the cause, who was responsible for their deaths? The bandits recoiled in horror, one of them shouting in panic that hidden weapons had been used. Mujin stepped forward with a smirk, holding the needles confidently. He declared that they had indeed been laced with poison strong enough to kill with a single scratch. Privately, he muttered to himself that luck had given them this chance, but they could not afford to waste it. Lifting his voice again, he told the bandits they could attack if they wished, but at least half of them would share the same fate. He offered another option: end the fight here. Their leader's death meant nothing compared to the treasures they hoarded, but Mujin and Jusan were not after wealth. They were there only for the kidnapped child. One of the bandits stammered in disbelief, asking if they had truly done all this just for a group of beggar brats. Jusan nodded firmly, confirming it. The man trembled as he pressed further, asking if they truly did not care about the treasures. Without answering directly, Mujin and Jusan turned their backs and walked deeper into the cave. The bandits screamed after them, demanding to know how he was supposed to believe them. Mujin glanced back slightly, raised his sword, and said coldly that belief was irrelevant. Fighting further would only lead to their deaths, and if they understood that, they should simply let the 2 of them pass. The pair disappeared into the left passage. Mujin's final warning echoed behind them, promising that anyone who followed would face the heaven-clouding flower rain. The bandits remained frozen, staring after them until chaos broke out. They shoved one another, yelling about who should lead, their fear spilling over into panic as they rushed to flee the cave. Hidden around a corner, Mujin and Jusan watched nervously. When the coast cleared, a familiar voice echoed through the cavern, calling for his father. They turned quickly and saw So-sun, locked inside a cell. Relief washed over them. After some effort, they freed So-sun and the other kidnapped beggar children. So-sun embraced his father in tears, while the others were reunited with their families. Later, as Mujin and Jusan prepared to leave, the beggars under the bridge bowed in gratitude. Jusan waved happily at them, while Mujin glanced at him and noticed the wound on his pinky. He thought silently that it was fortunate Jusan had not been injured more severely when grabbing the axe's blade. Still, he muttered in his mind about the ridiculousness of Jusan's so-called hemp harvest beggar move. Once again, his master had indirectly helped him. When they returned to their lodging, Mujin asked Jusan what his plans were. Jusan admitted he was uncertain, and asked if it would be all right to travel with him for the time being. Internally, he worried about how the red-faced old beggar of the secular faction would treat him, and whether staying in Chongqing was even possible. He also wondered briefly if traveling with Mujin might put them in danger. Mujin cut off his thoughts with a teasing remark. He said it seemed that a beggar who owed him his life was now begging for another chance to travel together. Jusan shouted back in protest, claiming it was not begging but a request, or even an offer. Mujin ignored him, and continued, asking who paid for the meals, who bought the drinks, and who provided new clothes. Jusan answered each with embarrassment, admitting that Mujin did, though he muttered that he did not need new clothes. Mujin burst out laughing, declaring that at this point, he was not simply helping, but fully sponsoring him. As they entered their room, a familiar voice rang out. It was Li Chung, who remarked that it seemed they had enjoyed themselves while he had been gone. He noted that the sword he had provided had come in handy. Mujin greeted him respectfully, saying he would not call their ordeal fun, but asked where he had gone with the 100 silver nyang. Li Chung admitted bluntly that he had gambled it away. He then told them to sit, saying he had something to explain. He asked if they knew of the war between the secular and traditional factions of the beggar sect in Chongqing many years ago. By the next day, news of Mujin and Jusan's victory over the Yangtze River stronghold leaders spread throughout Chongqing. The people filled the streets with chatter. Some celebrated, some doubted the tale. Rumors swirled that 2 young men had slain him, though many questioned if they were martial artists from renowned sects. When they heard one was a blacksmith named Tang, confusion only deepened. Still, they agreed on one thing: at least for now, they were free of the river bandits. At the docks, a man shouted for passengers departing for Wuhan. By the time Mujin boarded, 2 weeks had passed since they had left Chongqing, and the story of the stronghold had spread far and wide. On the deck of the ship, Mujin reflected that their unexpected struggle for survival had paid off. He recalled the merchants who had shown gratitude, covering their fare and gifting them gold. Yet, as he unsheathed his sword, he thought that the true reward was realizing how often power was needed unexpectedly. If he had neglected training in the black tortoise cultivation method, he would not have survived, not against the stronghold leader, and not even against the lackeys. With 2 weeks left aboard the ship, he resolved to make the most of the time, training until he could keep his balance no matter how unsteady the floor became. Mujin began practicing on the deck, his sword slicing through the night air. Nearby, Jusan sat watching, muttering to himself in amazement. He wondered when Mujin had become so strong, noting that he had already lost 7 or 8 sparring matches since they left Chongqing. Mujin ignored him, his mind focused on his goal of becoming one with his weapon, the soul-severing sword. His training was interrupted when applause echoed from nearby. Startled, Mujin turned and saw a man clapping politely. The man bowed with a smile, apologizing for intruding. He explained that he had only come to admire the moon, and had accidentally witnessed Mujin's training. He bowed again, saying he should not have watched without permission. Mujin returned the bow, startled to realize it was already night. The man then introduced himself as Namgong Myung, and, with a calm smile, asked if Mujin would be interested in a duel. Namgong Myung recalled his journey as he stood on the deck. He introduced himself in thought as the eldest son of the Namgong clan, and a first-rate martial artist. Yet, as he admitted inwardly, he was simply returning home by boat after his first adventure in the Jianghu, having achieved very little. He had only defeated a few bandits and demonic heads, and he worried deeply about disappointing his father. During that voyage, however, he met a woman unlike any he had encountered before. She was not intimidated by the Namgong name, which usually forced unwanted expectations onto others. For the first time, Namgong Myung had to put effort into winning over someone's heart, but when he did, he felt free. Spending time with her made the suffocating expectations of his clan fade away like morning dew. He remembered giving her a branch from a blossom tree, a gesture of affection. Just as he did, Tang Mujin suddenly appeared, asking if they could use the branch to treat a case of food poisoning on the boat. Mujin explained that the inner bark of the tree was good for curing such an illness. The woman smiled warmly, and said it was more important to help the sick. Mujin thanked her sincerely, and Namgong Myung's moment was broken. He thought bitterly to himself that the damned man, who played physician by day and trained martial arts at night, had ruined everything. Returning to the present, Namgong Myung looked at Mujin and insisted on a duel. Mujin, confused, asked if he had heard correctly, and wondered aloud about the Namgong clan. Inwardly, Namgong Myung cursed him, and vowed to crush him in the name of his clan. The woman watched curiously from the side, as both men drew their swords. Mujin hesitated, noticing his own weapon was real while Namgong Myung only carried a wooden one. He asked if it would be all right. Namgong Myung replied confidently that it was fine since he had interrupted Mujin's training. He added that it amazed him to see a man from a family of physicians enter the world of martial arts, and he was grateful for the chance to broaden his perspective. Quietly, he muttered that he was thankful to finally have a fitting conclusion to his dull adventure. Mujin answered awkwardly, saying he hoped to learn from him. Yet, as he clenched his lips, he thought to himself that he had walked into something dangerous. He had only ever heard stories of the Namgong clan before leaving Sichuan, tales that made them sound legendary. Now he found himself facing one of their martial artists, and for what? For the sake of a woman's attention? Mujin recognized the look in Namgong Myung's eyes. It was the same hunger he had seen countless times in troublemakers who came into the clinic. With a sinking feeling, Mujin thought he should simply lose quickly, and swung his sword clumsily. Namgong Myung smirked, evaluating the strike. To him, it looked like the attack of a second-rate martial artist, slow and predictable. He judged that at best Mujin might aim for the shoulder after feinting at the head. His desire to crush him faded, but he decided he should at least teach the man a lesson. Perhaps, he thought, This way Mujin could learn to handle a few bandits properly. He planned to deflect the attack using the Infinite Azure martial arts, a style that demonstrated how softness could overcome strength. He stepped forward, ready to redirect Mujin's trajectory, but in an instant his eyes widened in shock. His wooden sword snapped in half, the top part cleanly severed by Mujin's blade. At this rate, the sword would strike his shoulder. Panic overtook him as he realized Mujin's lack of control made the strike even faster than intended. He rolled sideways in desperation, crashing back first into the railing. Mujin rushed toward him, crouched down in concern, and apologized quickly. He admitted he was not used to using a real sword in friendly duels and had been too rash. Namgong Myung forced a smile, stretched out his hand, and played it off with bravado. He claimed this sort of thing happened often in the Namgong clan, and suggested the wooden sword had simply been weak. Flipping to his feet, he thanked Mujin for the teaching. Mujin apologized again, saying he was sorry for making him use such an old weapon. Namgong Myung insisted it was fine, and suggested ending the duel since there were no more wooden swords available. Inside, he marveled at Mujin's blade, admitting to himself that he could not even feel when it cut through his weapon. Out loud, he claimed he had been enlightened by the experience and did not want to lose the lesson. Mujin thought irritably to himself that he had only blamed the wooden sword to save Namgong's pride, but the man would not let it go. Suddenly Namgong Myung raised his real sword and begged for another match. Mujin staggered back, asking in disbelief if he meant to duel with a real weapon. Namgong Myung assured him he would neither use chi nor dangerous techniques. Inside, however, he cursed Mujin with fury. He told himself that this man had ruined all of his efforts to impress the woman, and swore not to let him destroy his pure-hearted love. The woman, covering her face with her fan, laughed silently at the ridiculous situation. Namgong Myung raised his sword, and proclaimed that with one of the 5 great swords of the Namgong clan, the Three-Peaked Sword, he would show Mujin the clan's true power. Mujin reluctantly accepted, muttering that he only agreed because of the man's insistence. He wondered how desperate Namgong Myung was for a woman's attention. He raised his sword awkwardly once more, and prepared to swing. He reasoned that if he used the same simple attack, his opponent would surely deflect it. Namgong Myung braced himself, believing that though the strike was the same, he could counter it differently this time. He resolved to redirect the blow once more, but when their blades clashed, his eyes widened in horror. Mujin's sword chipped the legendary Three-Peaked Sword. He shouted in disbelief that one of the 5 great swords of his clan was being damaged. Chi burst out of his body instinctively, surrounding him. Realization hit as he muttered in panic that he had promised not to use it. Mujin immediately accused him of breaking his word. Namgong Myung apologized profusely, stammering that in the Namgong clan giving their all was a habit, and he had done it without thinking. Mujin reprimanded him, pointing out that a promise was a promise and that he kept boasting about his clan. He ended the fight, saying they should be thankful no one was hurt. He sheathed his sword firmly. Namgong Myung bowed and accepted defeat, but his thoughts were filled with shame. He admitted silently that he had embarrassed himself 3 times in such a short span, and had even dragged the clan's name into it to mask his failure. He cursed what others would think if they heard. Mujin, irritated, gave him a side glance and muttered that most people would have attacked if they caught someone spying on their training. He grumbled that he was restraining himself only because of the Namgong name. Namgong Myung looked at his broken sword and panicked. If he returned home with it in such a state, his father and the elders would be furious. He imagined his father's wrath, and felt pale, sweat pouring down his face. He whispered repeatedly, begging for forgiveness and muttering that he was sorry. His thoughts raced as he questioned what kind of sword Mujin possessed. Perhaps, he thought, it was a divine relic. The possibility hit him hard, and his gaze sharpened with greed. Mujin approached, assuring him there was no need to beg. He said that although problems had arisen, Namgong Myung had been generous with his conditions from the start, so they should consider it an accident. Namgong Myung thanked him sincerely, but then asked if he would consider selling the sword. Mujin refused immediately, saying it was too special. Namgong Myung laughed awkwardly, apologized for the request, and bowed again. He wished Mujin a good night, and left with the lady. Mujin watched him go, muttering that the man was truly dangerous. He thought he had never seen anyone more carefree than Red Beggar, and resolved to avoid Namgong Myung for the rest of the week on the boat. 7 days later, the ship arrived at Wuhan. Mujin screamed in shock from inside his quarters, his voice echoing across the deck. Jusan peeked in, and asked what was wrong. Mujin stood trembling with rage, his face twisted with anger, as he cursed loudly. Somewhere else, Namgong Myung rode a horse at full speed, laughing with delight. He shouted that he had obtained a divine sword, and declared his first adventure in the Jianghu a success. At the Namgong clan estate, a stableman was leading a horse toward the stable. He fed it while chuckling, telling the animal that eating so quickly would only give it a stomachache. He wondered aloud just how hard it had run and noted that its hindquarters and stomach were caked with dirt. From this, he guessed that young Master Myung must have gotten quite dirty as well. The man then muttered to himself, hoping that the clan head would be pleased with the young master's first travels. It would be unfortunate, he said, if the boy ended up punished after finally returning home. Meanwhile, at the Dragon Ascent Pavilion, Namgong Myung stood outside covered in dirt with the stolen sword strapped to his back. He tilted his head toward the sky as though to gather courage. After a moment, he patted the dirt off his clothes, slapped both cheeks to ready himself, and exhaled deeply. With a sudden surge of determination, he slammed the door open and shouted for his father, announcing his return from his first ventures through the Jianghu. Inside, 3 elders stood together, their eyes fixed on him. Namgong Myung dropped to his knees, placed the stolen sword in front of him, and raised it high with trembling hands. He declared loudly that there was something he urgently needed to present. His father stepped forward, gazing down at him with stern eyes. He said that indeed, this was something Myung must show him as soon as he returned, but asked if his supposed success had been so great that he would dare to intrude in the middle of a meeting with the elders. Bowing his head in shame, Namgong Myung extended the sword. His body shook as he offered it, and after a pause, his father reached down and took it from him. Later that night, the Namgong clan held a celebration to commemorate Myung's supposed achievements. Outside the annex, Li Chung spoke casually to Mu Jin. He mocked the occasion, saying it was a feast for a man's first ventures through the Jianghu, and then revealed that Namgong Myung was none other than the son of Namgong Jinchan. Mu Jin froze, shocked, and stammered in disbelief. He asked if Li Chung truly meant Namgong Jinchan, the sword spirit, one of the 6 supremes. Li Chung confirmed it, remarking that this was exactly why such an extravagant feast was being held. He added coldly that Myung had stolen Mu Jin's sword. The 3 of them entered the annex to join the gathering. Mu Jin clenched his teeth in anger, asking aloud how anyone could be proud of theft. Li Chung laughed and told him that Myung would never admit he had stolen the sword from an innocent man. He would instead tell his father that he had obtained it through some fortunate stroke of luck. Mu Jin gritted his teeth harder, fury flashing in his eyes, and cursed Myung as damned. Li Chung cut him off, saying this was actually a good thing. A feast full of witnesses, he explained, was the perfect opportunity to expose a thief whose father was none other than the sword spirit himself. Mu Jin asked nervously if Li Chung had a plan. Li Chung scoffed, and replied that no half-formed plan could ever work on the sword spirit, a transcendent master of the pinnacle realm and the head of the greatest martial clan in all of Murim. Mu Jin then suggested that perhaps it would be better to wait until the feast was over, since taking action now could ruin the event and create a grudge. Li Chung shook his head and told him he was being too innocent. He explained that prestigious clans thought in an entirely different way from people like them. Such clans only cared about their name, he said, and the only way to deal with them was to humiliate them in front of others, like a true mad dog. At that moment, one of the Namgong elders spotted Li Chung and approached with a loud greeting. It was Namgong Jinya. He called out to Li Chung in surprise, saying he had not expected to see him there. Li Chung smirked and pointed at him, mocking him by asking if the missing arm he had once chopped off still itched at night. Jinya ignored the taunt and explained for Mu Jin's benefit that Li Chung had amputated it to stop the spread of poison. He then remarked that he had never seen Li Chung travel with a companion before, and asked who the young man with him was. Li Chung gestured toward Mu Jin and explained that he was a physician who had ended up traveling with him. He added that Mu Jin had some business to resolve with the Namgong family as well. Jinya, curious, repeated the word business with suspicion. Before anything further could be said, a loud announcement echoed throughout the annex. The clan head Namgong Jinchan entered with Namgong Myung and one of the elders at his side. The crowd erupted into cheers as the announcer proclaimed their arrival. Jinchan and Myung stepped forward, Myung carrying a container that held the stolen sword. They displayed it proudly before the crowd. Jinchan raised his voice, thanking everyone for joining the celebratory feast of his son's first venture into the Murim. He admitted his son was still inexperienced, but declared that during his journey, by a stroke of luck, he had obtained a divine sword. He called for a ceremonial liquor to be dedicated to the heavens in gratitude, and asked everyone to celebrate this fortune together to ensure the glory of the Namgong clan. The crowd roared their approval, shouting congratulations to the sword spirit, and praising Namgong Myung for performing many acts of justice. At the front, Namgong Myung stood proudly beside his father with a smug smile on his face as he drank. Near the back, Li Cheng and Mu Jin listened as Namgong Jinya trembled in disbelief. The elder muttered to himself that Myung had told an enormous lie. He clenched his fist and whispered with fear that if his brother discovered the truth, he would destroy Myung's chi core. He added that Jinchan might even go so far as to imprison his own son for life. Mu Jin turned to Li Cheng in shock, whispering if that could really be true. He could not believe that a father would do such a thing, not even to an enemy, let alone his own child. Li Cheng replied coldly that this was simply the weight of the Namgong name. To sully it was such a crime that even a son would be treated as a criminal. He said that all injustices must be endured under the name of the clan, and that was the responsibility of being born into such a prestigious family. Hearing this, Mu Jin muttered under his breath that although he thought Myung was an asshole, he felt guilty knowing that reclaiming his sword might lead to the young master's downfall. At that moment, Namgong Jinya reached out and grabbed Mu Jin's hand. He begged him to overlook the mistake just this once, and promised that he would personally compensate him in Myung's place. Mu Jin stammered in confusion, but before he could answer, Li Cheng stepped in with a cold voice. He told Jinya not to be ridiculous, saying that by making such a request of a young man, Jinya was essentially making a threat. He asked what kind of clan, one that worshipped the sword above all else, would ever demand that a martial artist forgive the theft of his sword. Jinya turned to Li Cheng and asked if Mu Jin was not just a physician. Then he laughed, realizing that as Li Cheng's companion, Mu Jin must also be a martial artist. He lowered his head to Mu Jin and admitted that the decision lay with him. He apologized and asked him to consider again, saying that all Myung had done was try to earn his father's approval. Li Cheng cut him off once more, his words sharp. He asked if Jinya had forgotten about karma, warning that Myung's sins and skills were his own responsibility. He said he understood Jinya's worry for his nephew, but reminded him that the Namgong clan was the very family Jinya and his brother had devoted their lives to protecting. He demanded to know if Jinya intended to allow a child who hid behind the clan's name to become its next head. If not, then he told him bluntly not to interfere. Li Cheng then strode into the center of the annex. Qi radiated from his body as he lifted his leg high. Mu Jin and Jinya both gasped in shock, watching as Li Cheng slammed his foot down with tremendous force. The floor cracked beneath the impact, and a shockwave rippled through the hall, forcing people to stumble back. Cries of alarm filled the air, with one voice shouting in panic, demanding to know who would unleash such a powerful step. The crowd scattered in fear, clearing space around him. At the front, Namgong Jinchan fixed him with a cold, commanding stare. Li Cheng grinned at him and called out, saying it had been a long time. He apologized for interrupting the celebration, but declared that he had come to retrieve the sword. Namgong Myung's proud expression immediately twisted into dread upon hearing his words. Li Cheng pointed toward Mu Jin and raised his voice so all could hear. He announced that the blade was called the soul-severing sword, and that it belonged to the young man standing beside him. Mu Jin's face paled as he realized what his master had just done. Overcome with shock and fury, he shouted back in disbelief, cursing Li Cheng in front of the entire Namgong clan. Namgong Jinchan spoke with a firm tone as he addressed the eccentric physician. He declared that Li Cheng, true to his title, had appeared out of nowhere to make strange claims. Yet, he admitted that he knew the man was not one to speak baselessly. With a stern expression, he demanded to know what was going on. At his side, his son Namgong Myung clenched his lips, his entire body trembling under the weight of his father's voice. Jinchan pressed him further and ordered him to speak. Li Cheng scoffed and responded with confidence. He explained that young Namgong Myung, after completing his first ventures in the Zhenghu, had obtained the sword by certain means. But before he could finish, Mu Jin suddenly stepped forward and cut him off, yelling loudly in desperation. He addressed the Namgong patriarch directly, saying that he could explain. Jinchan's gaze bore down on him like steel, forcing Mu Jin to steady himself as he spoke. He explained that not long ago, a prized treasure of his family, the soul-severing sword, had been stolen from him. During his journey to recover it, he had heard that Namgong Myung had come into possession of the blade. That was why he had come here, to retrieve his family's treasure. At the back, Namgong Jinya was stunned by what he heard. His lips parted as he muttered the young man's name in disbelief. Tang Mu Jin. Mu Jin continued his explanation, admitting that it was undoubtedly his fault that he had failed to protect the sword. Lowering his head, he bowed deeply and pleaded for assistance, begging to be allowed to safeguard his family's treasure once more. At the front, Namgong Myung's thoughts churned. He clenched his teeth as he realized that Mu Jin was covering for his lies. He could not understand why the man would do such a thing. But more importantly, he knew he needed to gauge his father's reaction before deciding his next step. Namgong Jinchan walked toward the display where the sword was placed. Without hesitation, he drew the blade, then hurled it in front of Mujin. Mujin froze in shock at the patriarch's bold action. From the side, Li Cheng smirked, declaring with amusement that this was truly a feast, since even the clan head himself had joined in the festivities. Jin Yan's sharp voice rang out once more. He demanded to know if Mujin could prove that the sword was truly his family heirloom. He warned that if he could not prove it, he would have to take responsibility. Mujin staggered backward under the patriarch's piercing gaze. His thoughts raced in panic. If he could not prove it, he was dead for certain. He asked himself what he should do. His eyes turned toward his master, and he muttered aloud what Sir would do in his place. Li Cheng scoffed at his apprentice and mocked him, asking why he was looking at him. He reminded him that it was supposed to be his family heirloom. Mujin cursed under his breath, realizing his master was clearly forcing him to figure it out for himself. He looked at the sword lying before him and thought desperately. Since he had claimed it was his family's heirloom, he could not simply prove it by forging another one. He wondered if he should insist that he could craft another sword identical to it. Then, suddenly, a realization struck him. With renewed determination, he called out to the patriarch respectfully. He proclaimed that the soul-severing sword held a hidden secret. Using a secret art of his family in a place with fire and no other people, he claimed he could make the sword give birth to another sword. In fact, he insisted that the sword was in its final month of pregnancy and would deliver its offspring in just 5 days. The hall fell into complete silence after his words. Then, after a tense pause, a burst of laughter erupted, echoing across the entire area. From within the crowd, someone muttered aloud that perhaps says the sword would have a baby was going a little too far. Namgung Jinchan ignored the laughter and instead turned toward Li Cheng. He demanded to know if the eccentric physician would stand as Tang Mujin's guarantor and uphold his outrageous claim. Li Cheng, without hesitation, responded with confidence. He swore on his name, declaring that although he often played pranks, he never lied. The patriarch stared intently at both master and disciple for a long moment before finally speaking. He declared that Tang Mujin would go to the abandoned forge on the southern hill. If within 5 days he could not bring forth the sword's so-called offspring, then both he and Li Cheng would have to give up their heads. Later, at the abandoned forge, Li Cheng sat outside while Mujin carried firewood inside. The eccentric physician called out to his disciple and told him bluntly that he should not have done that. Mujin looked confused and asked what he meant. He wondered aloud if it was about the story he had made up, about the sword giving birth. Li Cheng dismissed that as irrelevant. He explained that whether it was about a baby sword or even breastfeeding a blade, that was not the real issue. He reminded Mujin why he had told him to be a mad dog, rather than allow others to take advantage of him. Mujin asked if it was so that he did not look like a fool. Li Cheng confirmed it, and told him that the most important thing in avoiding exploitation was to make people pay back what they owed. He scolded him by saying that, in this situation, he had been an excellent fool. Mujin tried to laugh it off, and said happily that he was just a generous man. He insisted that the whole eye for an eye philosophy did not suit him. Li Cheng stood up and nagged at him sternly. He told him that this was not a matter where he should have extended such generosity. There were many simple matters in the world that could be overlooked, he said. But just as one must not repay kindness with evil, one must never repay evil with kindness. Mujin grew nervous and stammered that he did not think they needed to be so strict about it. He reasoned that Namgung Jinia and Namgung Myung would surely be thankful to him. Li Cheng rejected the notion. He explained that such behavior might suit a small village physician, but Mujin would soon be facing martial artists. In their world, if he repaid kindness with evil, he would turn everyone against him. On the other hand, if he repaid evil with kindness, he would attract hyenas looking to stab him in the back. Mujin tried to reason that he could simply continue to perform acts of kindness. Rather than make 10 enemies, he argued, he would only need to worry about 1. Li Cheng shook his head and explained that Mujin still did not understand the nature of the martial arts world. He told him that the ill will of martial artists always ended in steel and blood. Pointing a finger at his disciple's chest, he warned him to always keep his enemies in sight. He told him never to create dangers behind his back for the sake of cheap kindness. Then, smacking Mujin lightly on the head, he reminded him that though Namgung Jinia's words may have bothered him, he should not have allowed them to soften his intent. Li Cheng sat down again and continued his lecture. He said that because Mujin was a physician, he would perform countless acts of kindness in the future, so he needed to pay careful attention to this lesson. Whether good or bad, He had to repay what he received in kind. He must not be the one who ended up regretting things after being taken advantage of. Mujin finally muttered his understanding and turned to his task. He began forging another sword. 5 days later, back at the Namgung clan's main hall, Mujin presented the newly forged weapon. One of the Namgung martial artists tested it by clashing it against one of the clan's best swords. To the astonishment of the entire crowd, the weapon known as the Three-Peak Sword was cleaved cleanly in two. Gasps echoed through the hall. Someone exclaimed that it was a divine sword. Then the crowd erupted, shouting in disbelief that both blades were divine swords. Another martial artist stepped forward and, still overwhelmed, addressed the patriarch directly. He stammered that both swords were real. He suggested that one of them must surely be a replica, as he had assumed they had merely searched for a similar weapon in the past 5 days. But what he had just witnessed truly seemed as if the sword had given birth. He spoke of the sharpness of the blade, the tremors he felt as he cut through the air, and the perfect balance that made it feel weightless. He admitted he could not even tell which sword had originally belonged to Namgung Myung, since both appeared to be twin swords, crafted by the same hand. Namgung Jinshan scoffed, then suddenly burst into thunderous laughter that rang out across the Namgung clan estate. With great amusement, he declared that they were indeed a pair of twin swords. He pointed toward Mujin and revealed that the true mother sword was standing right there before them. Mujin lifted yet another blade and cleaved another one of the Namgung clan's finest swords in two. The crowd erupted in an even greater uproar, crying out in shock that they were now 3 real swords. At the front, Namgung Myung lowered his head in disbelief and muttered that he did not know how Mujin had managed it. Yet, as he had proven himself the rightful owner of the blade, odd deeds would return to how they should be. Mujin seized upon those very words and repeated them aloud. He proclaimed that indeed, odd deeds would return to their rightful place. He declared that even a mere dog found a nest to rest when it was time to lay its pups, and that whatever had happened, there must have been a reason the sword had ended up with the Namgung heir. With a grateful smile, he thanked Namgung Myung for taking care of the soul-severing sword until now, and respectfully asked him to continue taking good care of it. Later, at one of the Namgung quarters, Tang Mujin let out a long sigh of relief and slumped back in exhaustion. He exhaled loudly and admitted that he had truly thought he was going to die. Then, with a bright grin, he turned to Yi Chung beside him and asked if things hadn't gone rather well. Yi Chung gave him a knowing look and responded dryly, asking whether Mujin was referring to how well he had hidden his trembling legs. He acknowledged that things had gone well this time, but warned that there was no guarantee it would always be so. He reminded Mujin never to let his guard down. Still cheerful and hugging his sword to his chest like a prized possession, Mujin laughed and promised that he would keep that in mind. Yi Chung nodded slightly, his tone turning more serious as he said that it was not all over yet. He explained that favors were a two-way matter, and it was now time for them to receive one in return. Mujin tilted his head in confusion and asked what his master meant by that. Before Yi Chung could reply, a sharp knock suddenly echoed from the door. Yi Chung gave a small scoff, as though he had expected the timing, and muttered quietly that it was truly a case of speaking of the devil. The door creaked open to reveal Namgung Jinshan standing with a sword in hand, while his son, Namgung Myung, followed behind him with his head bowed low in shame. Jinshan entered the room and stood in silence for a brief moment, his sharp eyes studying both Mujin and Yi Chung before finally speaking. He said that he should begin with an apology, for his foolish son had done something disgraceful. He had heard that Myung had run away with a sword. Mujin hesitated, his voice faltering as he began to respond uncertainly. Before he could finish, Jinshan interrupted and said there was no need to hesitate, as his son had already told him the truth. Lifting the sword that Mujin had crafted, Jinshan stated solemnly that now that the truth had come to light, he had to pay the price. Mujin blinked nervously and repeated the words, asking what he meant by paying the price. Jinshan turned his gaze upon his son, and asked in a cold tone what had happened to the female servant who had stolen a silver ring 2 years ago. The room fell utterly silent. Trembling, Namgung Myung finally managed to answer in a quivering voice that her wrists had been cut off. Both Mujin and Yi Chung's eyes widened in horror as Jinshan drew his sword, shouting a single word, "Decided," before swinging the blade toward his own son. At that instant, Myung's mind was flooded with memories from his youth. He remembered himself as a young boy training with the sword alongside other disciples. Every memory he could recall involved holding a blade. To him, play and study were one and the same, and that was the only way of life he had ever known. Loyalty to the sword path and precision in its use were the guiding principles instilled by his father and family. It was the path of a patriarch, forged through discipline, rules, and endless training. He could endure the pain, the exhaustion, and even the beatings. Yet what he could never forget was the cold, distant back of his father as he walked away from him after every training session. That silent figure had always seemed to say, "You are not enough, be more. Become fit to be a patriarch, no matter what it takes." Driven by those unspoken words, Myeon had stolen the sword. Even if it was cowardly or shameful, he had convinced himself that the end justified the means. He only needed to become stronger. When he had been praised for obtaining the sword, he had clung to that moment as validation. Those excuses had been what kept him going. But now, as his father's sword came crashing down toward him, he realized he no longer needed them. A piercing sound filled the room as steel met steel. The blow never reached him. Tang Mujin had leapt in front of Myung, blocking Jinchan's sword with his own still-sheathed blade. Jinchan stared at him and asked sharply why he had interfered. He demanded to know why Mujin would stop him, declaring that a wrongdoing committed by the hand should be repaid by the hand. Mujin clenched his jaw and answered that Myeon had indeed done wrong, but Jinchan himself had said that he had heard the truth. Mujin continued, saying he had also learned that one should repay their wrongs equally, but then questioned what he himself had done to repay his own misdeeds. He added that what truly mattered was not the form of repayment, but the sincerity behind it. Bowing deeply, Mujin implored the patriarch not to make the situation worse than it already was. For a moment, silence filled the room once more. Then Jinchan slowly sheathed his sword, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He returned Mujin's bow slightly, and said that Mujin was right. Thanks to him, Myung's wrist had been spared, and the problem had been contained. Jinchan added that Mujin had performed 3 great favors for them: saving Myung's wrist, preserving their honor, and offering wise words. He asked how he should repay such debts. The next day, Mujin, Yi Chung, and one of the Namgung elders walked through a long corridor together. Mujin's thoughts drifted back to the previous night. He remembered Myung kneeling before him, bowing so deeply that his forehead struck the ground as he swore, with trembling sincerity, that he would one day repay the grace Mujin had shown him. The memory faded when the elder beside him spoke, asking with a curious smile whether Mujin had really forged the sword in only 5 days. Startled, Mujin asked how he had known. The elder chuckled and explained that he had simply guessed from the redness of Mujin's hands and the rust under his nails. Laughing warmly, he remarked that the world was vast and filled with talented people, and then thanked Mujin for helping Myung. Embarrassed, Mujin scratched his head and said modestly that he was not talented at all. Inwardly, however, he wondered if Jinchan had truly meant what he said about repaying the favor. He thought bitterly that Yi Chung had already demanded everything they could possibly take. He recalled vividly how his master had stated their requests the night before: entry into the heavenly weapons storage, access to miracle medicines and poisons, and finally, a duel with the patriarch himself. Jinchan had agreed to all 3, while Yi Chung had warned him not to question the boy about it. Mujin could only sigh and think aloud that it would be nice if Jinchan truly followed through on his word. The elder walking ahead looked back at them with a wide smile and said that perhaps he was overstepping. But Shaolin might be waiting for someone like Mujin. Surprised, Mujin repeated the word Shaolin under his breath. The elder confirmed it, explaining that ever since his youth, Shaolin had been seeking individuals with remarkable skill in craftsmanship. There was something, he added, that even they could not repair. Yi Chung interjected, saying that the elder must be referring to the wooden figures. Mujin looked puzzled and asked what those were. Yi Chung explained that they were unique creations of Shaolin, and suggested that since Shaolin lay on the road to Luoyang, they could stop there if the opportunity arose. He then brightened and declared enthusiastically that it was time to claim their first reward. When they reached the Namgung clan's library, Mujin was awestruck by the sight before him. Shelves upon shelves of ancient manuals, scrolls, and books filled the grand hall. The elder gestured toward the vast collection and told him that he could choose one, as promised, urging him to take his time. Mujin bowed respectfully and thanked the Grand Master. Yi Chung began browsing the rows of books with great focus. After a few moments, Mujin asked what he was looking for. A sword technique perhaps, or a manual on footwork. Yi Chung's expression lit up when he found something. He pulled a book from the shelf, handed it to Mujin, and said that this was the one. Mujin's excitement turned instantly to disappointment as he read the title aloud. The book was called Fleeing Monkey. His face fell, and he muttered that he had gone through all that effort just to learn the ways of a monkey. He glanced longingly at the shelves and pointed out that there were sword techniques over there with impressive names like Divine Technique. He turned to his master, visibly frustrated, and shouted that he wanted something related to swords, not monkeys. Yi Cheng only smiled calmly and told him to stop complaining, saying that he should master that technique until they received the miracle medicine. Defeated, Mujin sighed and replied that he understood. Later, as they collected another of their promised rewards, Yi Cheng asked whether Mujin had memorized the manual. Mujin confirmed that he had, though he confessed that he did not understand a word of it. Yi Cheng nodded in approval and said that was good enough, instructing him to recall its teachings whenever he trained. Still unconvinced, Mujin asked if it was really useful. Yi Cheng brushed off the question with a lazy, yeah, and then, with a mischievous grin spreading across his face, told Mujin to eat something before he explained anything else. Mujin frowned and asked what he was supposed to eat, recoiling as Yi Cheng suddenly grabbed his face and forced his mouth open with his other hand. Mujin shouted for him to stop, saying that the expression on his face was terrifying. Yi Cheng chuckled darkly and revealed what he was holding in his other hand, a venom sac glistening faintly under the light. With a wide, unnerving grin, he told Mujin that it was tasty and good for his health. It was, he said, the venom of the seven-step serpent. Mujin began retching when he saw the venom sac in front of him. His face twisted in disgust as he shouted at the old man before him, demanding an explanation. He cried out, asking why anyone would eat such a thing. He reminded Yi Cheng that he had already forced him to memorize the fleeing monkey arts, and now wanted him to swallow a poison pouch. Mujin yelled that he at least deserved to know the reason for this madness. Yi Cheng clicked his tongue and smirked. His tone was teasing as he said that he would explain it when the time was right. He then added that this was a rare opportunity, a chance for Mujin to become the divine physician of Sichuan. With a mischievous grin, Yi Cheng poked Mujin's shoulder and declared excitedly that a divine physician could heal without using acupuncture, becoming a true master of healing itself. Mujin's expression, tense from anger and fear, began to soften into cautious relief. Taking a deep breath, he opened his mouth wide, closed his eyes, and exclaimed that he could already feel the blood clot releasing and his fatigue fading away. Yi Cheng leaned forward eagerly and asked how it felt, demanding to know whether he was ready to eat the venom sac. Mujin started to reply, hesitating as he said, "Ah, yes." But before he could finish, Yi Cheng stuffed the venom sac into his mouth and clamped a hand over it to stop him from spitting it out. Mujin struggled desperately, but it was too late. When he finally swallowed it, Yi Cheng crossed his arms and told him coldly that if he wanted to survive, he should not even think of throwing up. He had to embrace it completely. Mujin glared at him furiously, shouting that he was trying to kill his own partner. Yi Cheng laughed, saying that he had only said Mujin could die, not that he would actually kill him. With a smug look, he explained that from now on, he would make poison pouches into poison pills, and if Mujin wanted to live, he had to follow his instructions precisely. Still gagging, Mujin snapped back that if Yi Cheng intended to teach him, he should at least do it properly instead of constantly deceiving him. Yi Cheng pointed a finger at him and said sternly that they both had a duty to protect medical arts. He explained that unlike martial artists who sought fame by defeating others, physicians needed martial arts purely to survive, so that they could safeguard medicine. Mujin frowned and muttered that he still could not understand why a physician would be forced to eat poison. Yi Cheng's tone hardened as he reminded him of the fight he and the Red Beggar had against the pirates. Back then, after consuming the poison pouch, Mujin had been able to throw poison needles to buy time. Poison arts, Yi Cheng explained, could drastically increase the odds of survival in an instant. For that reason, one had to be capable of producing poison at will. As he spoke, a droplet of poison appeared on the tip of Yi Cheng's finger. He lifted it casually and said that although the name poison pill sounded intimidating, for a physician who understood both medicine and venom, it was equivalent to carrying an entire medicine warehouse inside the body. Whether it was used sparingly or excessively, properly or destructively, its use depended entirely on the physician. Mujin stared at him nervously, and admitted that it sounded like something an unorthodox faction would do. Yi Cheng scoffed at the remark. He said that such distinctions meant nothing to a true physician. The labels of orthodox and unorthodox were just arbitrary frameworks created by others, and he had no intention of walking along any of them. He continued that if a patient needed treatment, he would treat them regardless of their allegiance, but if someone spread disease or withheld cures, he would kill them without hesitation. He declared that the only path that mattered was the practical one. In a flash, he appeared behind Mujin and asked if he now understood why both the fleeing monkey arts and the poison pills were necessary. Mujin nodded quietly, saying yes. Yi Chung smirked and placed his hand firmly on Mujin's back. He told him to try to survive, because it was about time for the poison to spread. Mujin's eyes widened in alarm as his body began to react. His vision blurred, and he heard Yi Chung's voice grow distant and slow, as though it echoed from far away. Yi Chung instructed him to stay calm, warning that this poison was different from the black peony and required complete focus. He told him to wait quietly, even if it felt as though the poison was tearing through his stomach, staining his blood, and rampaging through his veins. He was not to panic. The more wildly it surged, Yi Chung said, the stronger the poison pill would become. He guided him through the process step by step, telling him that when his blood boiled and he began to feel the poison taking form within him, he should suppress it with inner energy and push it into his dantian. When the poison finally calmed, and it felt as though nothing had happened, that would be the moment of success. Time passed slowly. Mujin's body trembled as he endured the agony. When it finally ended, he exhaled deeply and opened his eyes. Relief washed over him as he realized that he had advanced. His master's method had been crude, but he understood its purpose. Suddenly, Hong Ju-san appeared in front of him, his expression filled with astonishment. He asked if Mujin was awake, and how he had managed to train for 5 days straight without rest. He even wondered if he was not starving. Mujin was stunned, repeating his words in disbelief. 5 days? He had thought it had only been half a day. He rose to his feet and asked urgently where the old man had gone. Ju-san replied that Yi Chung had complained about missing the chance to duel Namgung Jinqian, and had left. Then, with a teasing grin, he demanded to know what kind of training Mujin had done without him. Ju-san smirked as he mentioned that according to the old man, Mujin had eaten something valuable, something like a black peony. He complained that Mujin had eaten it alone. Mujin laughed and replied smugly that no matter how much Ju-san ate, it would never work for him. Ju-san's face darkened as he shot back that Mujin was nothing but a useless physician, and that whatever he had eaten probably was not even good. Grinning, Mujin raised a finger and said that if Ju-san was so curious, he would show him. He lifted his hand proudly, extended one finger toward the air, and told him to watch carefully because this would show the difference between them. He let out a sharp breath, shouting as a stream of poison spurted from his fingertip and landed on the table in front of them. Ju-san stared at it, his eyes narrowing as he examined the strange texture and smell. Behind him, Mujin grinned proudly and shouted that this was the difference between them. Ju-san tilted his head slightly and said in a deadpan voice that he congratulated Mujin. He could now have diarrhea through his hands. Mujin's face turned red with anger as he yelled for him to try it himself. Ju-san laughed mockingly, saying that he did not need a gap that made his hands smell like waste. While they bickered, Yi Chung entered the room unnoticed. With an exasperated roar, he smacked both of them on the head and shouted that they were always fooling around. He ordered them to stop talking and get ready to leave. Both immediately straightened and replied in unison, yes. The trio soon departed from the Namgung clan. After some time, they reached Henan Anhui. Mujin stretched his arms and sighed, complaining that he had wanted to stay and relax a bit longer at the Namgung clan. Yi Chung immediately barked back, asking how long it would take to reach Luoyang if they kept wasting time like this. He scolded Mujin, accusing him of slowing down his poison pill training, just so he could rest. Mujin argued that things never went as he wished, and reminded Yi Chung how much he had suffered after being fed the 7-treasure snake. The old man dismissed his excuse, saying that his struggles were only because of his poor concentration. Then he added bitterly that because of his delay, he had missed the chance to duel Namgung Jinqian, a rare opportunity he could not get again. Mujin pouted and said that if he had trained calmly like the Namgung clan, he would have finished faster. Yi Chung scoffed and replied that such excuses were meaningless. He began to lecture him loudly, saying that pirates would never give him time to meditate. He had seen countless so-called orthodox sect members who wasted time thinking about this and that only to die to weaker foes. Being part of a prestigious orthodox sect, he said, was not always beneficial. He declared that he would train Mujin personally, and that the boy only needed to follow the path he had laid out. Mujin frowned and retorted that Yi Chung was contradicting himself. He had just told him not to follow predetermined paths. He reminded him that he had even been the one to negotiate with the merchant group. Yi Chung smacked him on the head again, and shouted that practical experience mattered more than meditation, and that dynamic practice was better than static training. He told him never to die trapped in someone else's framework, but to survive instead. Understand, partner? He barked. Before Mujin could answer, one of the travelers walking with them shouted cheerfully that the next village would be the last stop on their journey. Mujin groaned and muttered that his master was starting to sound like an unorthodox faction member. Yi Chung immediately shouted back that between orthodox and unorthodox, there was no real difference. Before the argument could continue, Jusan interrupted excitedly, pointing ahead and shouting that there was an inn. He begged Mujin to buy him some dumplings. Mujin sighed and mumbled that he was completely broke again. Later, the three of them sat outside the inn eating together. Across the street, a frail man was speaking breathlessly with another man in a corner. The frail one asked if the goods had been brought. The other smiled and replied that of course they had, and asked how many bags were needed. The frail man said he would fetch some alcohol and told him to leave 3 bags behind for him. The man agreed, and the frail one hurried off, promising to return soon. Mujin's eyes followed him. He noticed the man's pale complexion, the heat rashes covering his skin, and his labored breathing. He thought silently that the symptoms looked like heat stroke. Turning to Yi Chung, he began to speak, calling out to him and trying to point toward the man. But he stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Yi Chung's trembling hand holding a chopstick. Startled, Mujin looked at his master's face and froze. Yi Chung's expression was twisted with anger as his gaze locked on the man in the corner. His voice was low and furious as he muttered the name of the man he recognized. "That's Oh Sok-san." At that same time, within the Nam family manor, workers inside a dimly lit building were busy grinding and mixing powders. The air was thick with dust and the stench of chemicals. Without warning, one of the workers began to convulse and collapsed onto the floor. The others turned in alarm toward the doorway, where a man stood watching in silence. The man's voice was cold and firm as he gave an order. "Put him in a pit and burn him." The workers stiffened. One of them quickly bowed his head and answered obediently, "Yes, Manor Master." After some time, Mujin, Jusan, and Li Chung arrived at the Nam family manor. As they traversed the path, Mujin thought bitterly about the medicine that made one feel as if they had ascended. The 5-mineral powder heightened one's mood and filled the body with heat, but taken too frequently, it caused both body and mind to rot away, eventually leading to death. It was truly a dangerous drug. Upon arriving before the Nam family manor, Mujin observed that the headquarters of those who manufactured the 5-mineral powder appeared quite normal. Jusan spoke to Li Chung, suggesting that both buyers and makers seemed satisfied with the arrangement, and according to the merchant they had met, the village had prospered thanks to the Nam family manor. Li Chung responded that normal people who were clueless might think that way, but the 5-mineral powder sapped one's life force and clouded their mind, ultimately making their flesh rot away. He called them subhuman scum, just like Physician Yame. At the mention of this name, Jusan gritted his teeth and shouted in recognition. Li Chung added with fury that all he cared about was eliminating those spreading illnesses, regardless of whether they had saved the town. Moreover, he believed he knew who was responsible for this incident. As the main door opened, a man appeared before them, stating they had been recommended by Merchant Yang. He explained the manor master was in the inner chambers and invited them to follow. While walking inside, Mujin observed that all the servants were trained in martial arts. He whispered to his master about his concerns regarding their plan, wondering if they would be overwhelmed by numbers. Li Chung responded telepathically that the manor master must be in cahoots with the Black Path mentioned by Merchant Yame. Though the martial artists were weaklings Mujin and Red Beggar could handle alone, there was no need to make a mess. He had a hunch and instructed them to enter the inner chambers first, promising to follow immediately. Mujin's body trembled in horror at this instruction, wondering if they were being used as bait because the manor master was a martial artist of the pinnacle realm. As Mujin placed his hand on the door of the inner chamber, he worried about a sword flying at him when he opened it. More importantly, he struggled with how to introduce himself. After considering various greetings, he decided to make a scary face like his master and pretend to be in the same trade, keeping his message short and concise. He flung the door open and shouted with a deep voice, "Give me 1 gold coin worth of the 5-mineral powder!" Suddenly, Mujin flinched as something was placed right before his face. It was a pouch of mineral powder, handed to him by a man with a bright smile who welcomed him as a dear customer. Mujin leaned back slightly, muttering that he had thought it was a weapon. Behind him, Jusan grinned and whispered about his stiffness. The man continued speaking, having heard from Merchant Yang and having waited for Mujin's arrival. He remarked that Mujin had a good eye for product and was quite bold. Mujin responded nervously, confirming the man had heard correctly. The man laughed, boasting about their top-notch quality and quantity, far superior to low-quality products. Since it was their first business together, he had added some extra on the house. Mujin forced a smile in response, internally wondering why his master had not yet arrived. The man's warm smile then turned into a wide grin as he expressed his desire to continue business for a long time. He mentioned they had been developing the product for 5 years and offered to let Mujin sample a dose first. Suddenly, a loud voice rang out from the door. "Nam Ryeonbu!" It was Lee Chung who shouted, immediately adding that he had known it was him. Lee Chung grinned widely and demanded Ryeonbu bring out all his goods at once, threatening to shove it all down his throat. Nam Ryeonbu staggered back instantly upon recognizing Lee Chung, shouting in alarm, "Ah! Eccentric physician!" Lee Chung pulled out his sword and pointed it at Ryeonbu's neck, leaning close to his face and warning him against trying to run again. He threatened to give him a new hole in his throat if he attempted to stand up. Nam Ryeonbu's knees gave out as he fell to his knees, begging for his life. Moments later, an attendant arrived outside the inner chamber carrying more mineral powder as ordered. Ryeonbu instructed him to leave it by the door and return to his duties. After the attendant departed, Ryeonbu knelt before the bricks of mineral powder, his body trembling as he pleaded with Lee Chung to spare his life. He promised never to make 5 mineral powder again, explaining he had done it to help starving villagers whom he could not bear to watch suffer. Lee Chung cut him off, pointing his sword while declaring that scum like him always loved making excuses. He reiterated that if Ryeonbu wanted to live, he must either consume all the powder or dispose of it immediately. Ryeonbu responded in fear that the powder could be sold for a whole chest full of gold. Lee Chung questioned if he was still worried about money. Ryeonbu lowered his head in apology, pausing before declaring he would burn it right then. He grabbed a lamp, poured oil on the mineral powder, and set it ablaze, watching the drugs burn with disappointment. Mujin stared down at the burning drugs, thinking they had taken care of the 5 mineral powder but wondering how to deal with the manor master without being discovered. He considered whether his master would want to end things quietly. Lee Chung sheathed his sword, clicked his tongue, and asked who else knew how to make the 5 mineral powder besides Ryeonbu. Ryeonbu immediately shook his head, insisting nobody else did and questioning why he would lie in such a situation. Behind them, Jusan scoffed and exclaimed that no one would believe his word, adding that Lee Chung never allowed those who treated others' lives as ways to make money to survive. Ryeonbu continued pleading desperately for his life. Lee Chung clicked his tongue firmly and told him to get out. Mujin was shocked at his master's response and shouted in disbelief. Ryeonbu instantly stood up with a joyful smile, thanking Lee Chung profusely. But without warning, Lee Chung pulled out his sword and thrust it through Ryeonbu's neck, emerging from his back. As Ryeonbu fell to the ground, Lee Chung spoke with a chilling tone. "I told you not to stand up earlier, but scum never know how to listen." He then instructed Mujin and Jusan to leave before it became annoying. Later, after exiting the Nam family manor, the 3 sat on a rock in the forest taking a break while eating. Mujin spoke to his master, admitting he had truly thought Lee Chung would spare Ryeonbu. Lee Chung scoffed, explaining that when he had first heard about Ryeonbu selling the powder years ago, he barely had 10 coins worth. Now, he was working with the Black Path to sell chestloads of it. Lee Chung questioned who knew what might happen later, noting that trash tends to attract more trash, and it would not take long before they expanded into a huge crime ring like the Yangtze River stronghold. Jusan agreed, stating that Physician Yame and the Nam family manor master were more subhuman than beggars. Lee Chung grinned, affirming that beggars were much more honest and hardworking than they were. He warned that they would continue to encounter countless subhuman scum from then on. Suddenly, Lee Chung noticed a group of masked men approaching from the distance. "And it'll continue to be more and more of a nuisance. For example, dinner guests who arrived faster than we anticipated." Both Mujin and Jusan were confused by Lee Chung's words, questioning what guests he meant. Suddenly, Lee Chung's image blurred as he disappeared. Both disciples were shocked, but their attention shifted to the group of masked men appearing in the distance. They shouted in recognition that they were Black Path members. Mujin stood up instantly, wondering if the Nam family manor had already sent people after them. Suddenly, Lee Chung's voice echoed from the shadows, announcing they would practice the heart-piercing sword with the guests that day. Mujin responded in confusion about practicing the heart-piercing sword. Lee Chung simply replied, "Yup." In an instant, one of the Black Path members' head was cleanly cut off. Both Mujin and Jusan readied themselves as the headless body fell to the ground. Lee Chung revealed himself to the remaining Black Path members, staring at them with a wide grin. The men staggered back in shock upon recognizing him, shouting in alarm that it was eccentric physician Yi Chung and not just some old man. The 3 remaining members immediately fled into the forest. Li Cheng turned his back to Mujin and Jusan, instructing them to handle one each while he took the one in the middle. He warned them to prepare for a lesson if they failed. Without hesitation, both Mujin and Jusan rushed forward, shouting in unison, "Yes, sir!" As Mujin chased the Black Path member through the woods, he marveled at the man's speed, wondering if he were some kind of animal to move so swiftly through the terrain. Yet he realized with surprise that he himself was running faster than he ever thought possible. He believed he was catching up to his target, attributing this newfound speed to his training in the purple cloud step technique. He recalled how he had initially dismissed the fleeing monkey arts as pointless, but now wondered if dedicated practice might make them genuinely useful. For the moment, however, he needed to focus on catching his quarry, fearing what the old man might do to him if he lost the trail, and knowing Red Beggar would never let him live down such a failure. His attention was momentarily diverted by a loud scream from behind. He turned his head briefly, wondering whether it was Sir or Red Beggar in trouble. After a few moments, he turned back toward his fleeing target, chiding himself for losing sight of his objective while contemplating his own improvement. He needed to hurry. Suddenly, the Black Path member stopped running and attacked Mujin with his sword. Mujin barely managed to dodge the strike by bending backward and sliding forward before coming to a stop. The Black Path member spoke with contempt, explaining that he had been running from the eccentric physician, not some brat like Mujin. He expressed surprise that Mujin had dodged his sword-drawing technique, acknowledging that his reaction time was not bad. However, he warned that Mujin had picked the wrong fight and better have prepared himself for crossing the Nam family manor. Mujin stared at his opponent, thinking to himself that the man had almost caught him with that attack. This fighter was definitely different from the river bandits of the Yangtze River stronghold. Mujin wondered if he would prove stronger than the stronghold leader. The Black Path member continued speaking, claiming he was merely doing what he was paid to do and not to take it personally. As he lunged forward to attack, Mujin barely managed to block each strike. While defending himself, Mujin noticed something was off about his opponent's technique. The man seemed to have numerous openings in his defense, particularly at his sides and neck. Unlike the stronghold leader who had played with his opponents, this fighter didn't appear to be baiting an attack. Mujin considered that unlike the bandits who had tried to swarm them, this man had clearly learned proper swordsmanship. He wondered if the man was simply the type who fought extremely cautiously even against weaker opponents. The Black Path member laughed mockingly, shouting, "Is running away all you learned from the eccentric physician?" As Mujin continued blocking and dodging, he clenched his lips, thinking that the man's laughter seemed too arrogant for someone fighting cautiously. He realized he could not keep blocking forever. In a swift move, Mujin stepped back, swung his sword against his opponent's blade, placed his sword beneath it, and shoved upward. The Black Path member's eyes widened in surprise. As Mujin prepared for a follow-up attack, the man barely dodged by stepping to the side and exclaimed, I guess you know how to swing a sword, you brat." Mujin sharpened his gaze, thinking to himself that this man truly was inferior to him in skill. The openings had not been feints after all. He was more surprised by his own improvement than his opponent was. He needed to finish the fight while his opponent was flustered. Suddenly, the Black Path member threw multiple daggers at Mujin. Though Mujin dodged some, others grazed him. He groaned as realization struck him. His eyes widened and his body began to tremble. The Black Path member explained that while Mujin might know a few tricks, this was his end. He noted that Mujin's sides must be tingling from the poison. Mujin thought nervously that his vision was becoming blurry. The man identified it as salamander poison that would make him lose control of his body within 15 minutes. He mockingly assured Mujin not to worry, as it would not hurt much when he watched a sword enter his throat. Rather than wait for the poison to take full effect, the man lunged forward and swung his sword, forcing Mujin to dodge backward. He then threw another set of daggers, declaring he would prefer if Mujin died before that. As Mujin struggled, he gritted his teeth and thought that the man was trying to make the poison spread faster by forcing him to move. However, he hardened his expression, determining that this was nothing compared to the 7-step serpent's venom. He would devour it. Mujin began circulating his chi, directing all the salamander poison toward the 7-step serpent's venom core within him. As the serpent venom consumed the salamander poison, his mind cleared and his vision sharpened. When he opened his eyes, he could see clearly again and watched the Black Path member rushing toward him. During the next exchange, the Black Path member demanded to know how Mujin was still moving, asking if he had a bezoar pearl in his mouth. Mujin readied himself to counterattack and declared firmly, "You curious? A few lizards can't even scratch my poison core, made from the 7-step serpent's venom." In a flash, Mujin cut down the Black Path member. He narrowed his eyes as he watched the man slowly fall to the ground. The wounded fighter groaned in pain, his body trembling as he held a knife in his hand. He struggled to speak, lamenting that he had lost to some brat like Mujin. As he tried to point the knife at Mujin, Mujin extended his sword forward, bracing for an attack. Then he noticed the man was actually trying to place the knife on his own wound to ease his pain. Mujin scoffed to himself, thinking the man would die soon anyway. The Black Path member began screaming repeatedly. "It hurts, stop. It hurts. So much. Kiddo, please have mercy." Mujin turned to walk away but suddenly stopped as memories of his past opponents and colleagues flashed through his mind. He approached the begging man, pointed his sword at him, then paused. Instead of striking, he placed his hand on the man's body and began inflicting the serpent venom throughout his system. As the venom spread, the Black Path member smirked and spoke with gratitude. "So I guess you weren't just some brat? Thank you. It doesn't hurt anymore. Thank you." After some time, Mujin returned to their original meeting spot. Li Cheng spoke to him immediately upon his arrival, saying, "You're late." Mujin responded with an awkward, yeah." He then began counting on his fingers, murmuring numbers under his breath. Li Cheng narrowed his eyes after seeing Mujin's expression. Mujin clenched his fist and exclaimed, "Are we going to go investigate the Black Path hideout now?" He continued counting as he looked at the fallen Black Path member nearby. After a few moments, as they began to depart, Li Cheng responded to Mujin's question. "Of course. Why wouldn't we? Get your stuff. Let's get going." Jusan added while looking at Mujin. "Yeah, you're quite sluggish after also having taken the longest." Mujin shouted back, "You wouldn't get it, red beggar." Jusan laughed in response. "Ha, I definitely wouldn't. Because it's a skill issue." From that day onward, Tang Mujin gained a habit, though he himself did not do it consciously. It was to count how many people he had killed and saved. The eccentric physician and the red beggar kept quiet about this peculiar behavior. Later that day, night had fallen as the group headed toward the Black Path's hideout. Mujin was still counting with his fingers silently. Li Cheng turned his head back slightly and saw Mujin counting by himself. He thought to himself that Mujin was shook, and it was no wonder. Every fight till then had been for his life, so he didn't feel as guilty. Though for a lad who had spent his whole life saving people's lives, killing so many people was weighing on him. Moreover, the moment you realize how much more skilled you are than those you kill changes things. Of course, some people deal with guilt better than others. But Mujin, then suddenly Jusan called out to Mujin from his side. "Hey Mujin, your clothes are torn. What happened? Was he strong?" Mujin responded that he beat him easily. Jusan then teased him, placing his hand on Mujin's shoulder and saying he was just worried about his little bro getting his clothes torn by mere second-rate assassins. He wondered what they would ever do with him. Noting how Mujin tried to study fighting like he would a book, Mujin demanded to know what the hell he was saying, calling him a beggar. Jusan told him it was all right, that he could count on his big bro and to just let him know if he got scared when they arrived at the Black Path's hideout. He shouldn't be ashamed of being weak, Jusan added, saying what's really shameful is not being able to admit it. Mujin narrowed his eyes with an annoyed expression and started to draw his sword, muttering that this damned beggar keeps talking. Jusan staggered back and asked whoa, if Mujin was drawing his sword at his big bro's heartfelt worries. He called him a bad boy, saying he can't hurt people just because he got angry. Mujin shouted that he wasn't angry. He was just killing a bug, a damn parasite. Jusan exclaimed that Mujin would call a proper beggar like him a parasite. And seeing as Mujin was resorting to personal attacks, he really was mad, wasn't he? As they squabbled in the back, Li Cheng, who was leading them, told them to shut up because they were almost there. A few moments later, they crouched down in the grass of a field and looked at the Black Path hideout from a distance. Jusan continued trolling Mujin, whispering right in Mujin's face, asking if he was mad. Mujin told him to shut up, calling him an idiot. They both smirked at each other. Seeing this, Li Cheng smiled faintly and thought to himself that he guessed he didn't need to worry about them. As they continued moving forward, they stumbled upon a sleeping Black Path member. Without hesitation, Li Cheng instantly drove his sword against the sleeping man. As they continued to press forward, Mujin asked Li Cheng if he thought they would be able to do it by themselves and what if they got surrounded. Li Cheng turned his head toward him, smirked, and responded that it was all right, that there wouldn't be too many. Looking at their assassins, they were just small fry sucking blood from a tiny village. He asked if Mujin was scared, reminding him that he said he had won easily earlier. Mujin responded that of course not, he was a proper first-rate. Jusan on the side butted in, saying he was a super first-rate. Li Cheng scoffed as he smacked them with the hilt of his sword on their heads, telling them that both of them still had ways to go till becoming first-rates, calling them dolts. He explained that people die when you slit their throats or stab their hearts, and that was all they should be worrying about. If they understood, they should spread up and scout the place. He reminded them once again that they didn't need to wipe them out, they just needed to kill the higher-ups who might know how to make the 5-mineral powder or burn their storage of ingredients. Also, if they met anyone, they shouldn't waste time checking them for a tattoo or anything, because the fact that they were there meant they were in on the crime. Mujin nodded. Then with a firm tone, Li Chung ordered them to go. With that, the three of them scattered around in different directions hurriedly. Mujin aimed for one of the houses nearby. As he approached the house, he peeked at the window to look inside and thought to himself that the shed was for food. He looked in the distance to see where Li Chung and Jusan were, then began walking forward as he shoved grass in front of him. He saw a sleeping man who woke up from the noise he just made. The man muttered, asking who was there. Without hesitation, Mujin instantly killed him. As he slowly stood up to look around, he started heading toward another house nearby. As he arrived, he peeked in the window and saw his master, Li Chung, on the other side of the house who was also peeking in the window. Li Chung gave Mujin a signal through the window. Then both of their attention turned to a house nearby where Jusan was. Jusan was giving both of them a signal to come over. After they arrived, they started to peek inside from the creases of the wall. A man inside was saying that right, so the customers they found just happened to know martial arts, and they just happened to kill Namryeon-bu. He asked if they thought they were joking, if they thought they were fools, and demanded if they thought he was a freaking dumbass. He said he let them have some crumbs because he knew they set this whole thing up, so why the hell did they pull this shit? He demanded to know if crumbs weren't enough anymore. Another man who was defending himself from the kicks of the man who was yelling responded that he really didn't know anything and had no clue what was happening. The first man shouted at him again, saying he thought lying would get him out of this, and to look at what had happened. He declared that whatever, when their boys brought back those fools, they would see whether he was lying or not, and told him to just wait. The man then walked toward the door angrily. As he stepped forward, he instantly noticed someone appeared right in front of him and shouted in surprise, asking who they were. But before he could finish, Li Chung, who was the man who appeared out of nowhere in front of him, drove his sword right into the man's neck. The other man who was on the ground was shocked at their appearance. Then Li Chung turned toward him and said, "So he was behind this whole thing, Merchant Yang." Merchant Yang's eyes widened in horror as his body began to tremble. Li Chung grinned and responded as he lowered his bloody sword, telling Merchant Yang to let him ask a few questions. Li Chung asked how many people around here knew how to make the 5-mineral powder. Merchant Yang responded that only Namryeon-bu knew. Li Chung put his sword right on Merchant Yang's neck and asked if he was sure, if he wasn't just pinning it on a dead man. Merchant Yang insisted it was the truth, explaining that neither the Black Tiger faction nor he knew the recipe. He said everyone knew the ingredients, but only Namryeon-bu knew how to actually make it work. Li Chung told him he would bite, and asked where they kept the ingredients. Merchant Yang explained they transported it to the Nam family manor as soon as they got the ingredients and produced the powder. He said that Namryeon-bu said a hideout in the mountains was too humid and it ruined the quality, and that they mined the cinnabar nearby whenever they ran out. Li Chung responded out loud that so they just needed to destroy the cinnabar mine, and thanked Merchant Yang for cooperating. Li Chung then stabbed Merchant Yang right in his gut. Later that morning, the three of them arrived at the cinnabar mine. Inside the mine was a pile of collected leaves and branches. Li Chung extended his hand toward the leaves, and suddenly his chi started to flare out and expand throughout the cave. As Mujin entered the cave with a huge rock in his hand, he thought to himself that such immense poisonous chi, he couldn't even approach the cave. He realized these mines wouldn't be causing any problems from now on. Time passed, and the cave entrance was now fully blocked with rocks. Elsewhere, Mujin, Li Chung and Jusan were walking in the middle of a grass field. Li Chung spoke out loud, saying they were far enough and should take a break over there. The group rested under a single tree in the middle of the grass field. As they dropped their things on the ground, Li Chung started stretching his body and spoke out loud, saying good work. He explained that if the enemy knew their place, they wouldn't send anyone else after them, but they couldn't be sure so they should keep a night watch for a few days. Mujin and Jusan agreed. Jusan said he could go first and told the other two to get some rest. He then turned toward Mujin and said he found something at the hideout earlier, pulling out a rock and asking if it was worth anything. Mujin was surprised after seeing the rock and exclaimed that it was meteor iron, that he had no clue those Black Path bastards had something so valuable. He said it wasn't a huge amount, but he might be able to make something amazing if he mixed it with other iron. Jusan asked if it was expensive. Mujin said of course, and that it felt refreshing to see good materials. Jusan questioned if he felt refreshed when looking at scrap metal. Mujin told him he wouldn't get it. As Li Chung lay on the ground, he looked at Mujin and Jusan and thought to himself that those simpletons, then closed his eyes and smiled, adding that he guessed he wouldn't need to worry about them. Mujin and Jusan continued speaking. Jusan said if Mujin sold what he made from that, he owed him half. Mujin reminded him that he said the beggar's sect shouldn't be messing with money. Jusan said he would receive that half in the form of food. Mujin pointed out that he already was receiving food. Then suddenly, Li Chung sat back up and stood up firmly. He gripped his sword from his back. Mujin and Jusan were shocked by his action. Mujin asked if they were too loud, but Li Chung shushed him down and said someone was coming, telling them to get ready. As Li Chung stared into the distance, a few people began to appear without warning. One of them spoke, saying he was wondering which fool decided they had a death wish, calling out the eccentric physician and asking if he was really doing this. Li Cheng smirked and responded that there was nothing wrong with a physician fighting off an illness, and he could say the same thing about the great super-heavy tyrant blade, Ah Hui, cleaning up for some thugs selling 5 mineral powder. Ah Hui grabbed his sword from his back, clenched his teeth, and responded that cleaning up was not what he was doing, that even a kid knows his permission is required to take refuge in his mountain. He explained that if they paid their protection fees on time, he couldn't care less who they killed or what they peddled. He said he had never had to take care of things himself, but to think he'd run into Li Cheng of all people. Li Cheng questioned the protection fees, asking if Ah Hui went soft for chump change, and said he didn't think it'd be worth losing his head over that. Ah Hui raised his sword and responded that all he had for himself was his name. He lunged forward and shouted, "Let me have your head so I can raise my fees, it'll grant that death wish of yours." Li Cheng lunged forward as well and shouted, "Ha! You know I'm aware old beasts have elixir cores, but you've even learned how to talk. Let's see how big your elixir core is." As the fight between Li Cheng and Ah Hui ensued, the other two men rushed forward toward Jusan and Mujin. Both Mujin and Jusan prepared themselves for the upcoming fight. Mujin thought to himself that he had never heard his sir tell him to prepare himself, so Ah Hui must be at least in the pinnacle martial realm, and that this guy here was also quite skilled. As the man who approached Mujin swung his blade, Mujin immediately blocked it with his sword. His eyes widened from the sheer force of the attack as he flew backwards. As he landed on the ground with his feet, he thought to himself that he was knocked back that far despite deflecting it, and that the man's power matched that of the Yonsei bandit captain. No, it was beyond that. The man in front of him continued to press forward as he swung his sword violently. Mujin barely blocked and dodged the attacks. As he dodged and blocked, he thought to himself that the attacks were fast and fluid, and there was a strong surge of chi behind them. He concluded the man was undoubtedly first-rate, and that it was a giant blade but he had almost no openings. Mujin shifted his body and continued his internal assessment, thinking, however, he still had a chance. He lunged forward and attacked the man. The man barely dodged the attack as he ducked down. Mujin added to his thoughts that he still had a chance. As Mujin was up in mid-air, he aimed directly at the man and his sword right at him. The man managed to block the attack. As Mujin landed on the ground, both of them paused for a moment as they looked at each other. Then Mujin spoke out loud, asking why they didn't introduce themselves. He gave his name as Tang Mujin and asked for the man's name. Mujin thought to himself that the difference in their chi was shaking his insides. The man in front then responded that his name was Yeuk-un. Mujin asked for his title. Yeuk-un said he didn't think he needed to tell him that. Mujin commented how cold that was. Mujin continued thinking to himself that Yeuk-un was fast but still reactable, that he was just a slightly faster, stronger red beggar with more chi and a sword, and it wasn't a big deal. Then he reconsidered, thinking okay, maybe it was a big deal, but everyone dies when their heart is pierced. Suddenly, Yeuk-un lunged forward. Mujin dodged the attack as he stepped back. As he dodged, he thought to himself to focus, that if he messed up he would lose a limb but he needed to push onwards. He reasoned that even if Yeuk-un's attacks were as fluid as water, if there were high tides, there would be low tides as well. He thought about how only proper acupuncture will properly pierce the nerves, and even the toughest and most jagged ores begin to take on a shape when hammered long enough. He reflected that medicine, smithing, and the sword were all about finding a path, one step at a time, and he would advance. As Mujin attacked, Yeuk-un barely dodged his attack as he ducked down. Yeuk-un thought to himself, cursing that he thought this brat was desperately dodging, but he was actually gauging him for an opening. He noted that Mujin was evading his blade more narrowly now, that he had a good sense for combat. Yeuk-un decided he would have to crush him whole. Yeuk-un jumped forward and launched a powerful strike. Mujin, who was still in the middle of dodging, was caught off guard. He struck Yeuk-un's sword to shove it away. The attack almost hit Mujin. Yeuk-un thought to himself that this bastard countered him by an inch, but it was over for him. He immediately shifted his body and rushed forward, giving Mujin no time. But as his attacks were about to land, Mujin jumped backwards to dodge the attack. In an instant, Mujin shifted his body and jumped toward the side of Yeuk-un. But before he could attack, a sudden flash of memory flashed in his mind. He sharpened his eyes and gave all his focus on Yeuk-un. As Yeuk-un tried to make a move at him, Mujin extended his sword forward, stabbing Yeuk-un right in his gut. Blood splattered around the grass as Yeuk-un fell to the ground. Mujin stared down at Yeuk-un with a serious expression. As he looked at Yeuk-un's wound, he looked at his hand and said, "The apex's motion." Then suddenly, Li Cheng at the back, who had already finished his fight, spoke toward Mujin, saying he expected him to take care of him with poison arts, but he saw Mujin was approaching a path he didn't expect him to. He commented that Mujin's form of the heart-piercing sword just now was quite decent. Mujin turned his head around and saw his master sitting on top of dead Ah Hui's body. He approached Li Cheng and said that Li Cheng seemed as if he wasn't looking forward to the fight, but he guessed he won pretty easily. Li Cheng stood up and responded, asking what Mujin took his sword skills for. He explained that with his poison arts on top of them, he couldn't lose even if he wanted to. He added that he just didn't want to kill someone he personally treated. Mujin looked at Ah Hui's lifeless body and said that pointing a sword at someone you owe your life to was despicable. He paused for a moment as he still looked down on Ah Hui. Li Cheng spoke out loud, saying that human morals aren't of much use to a wild animal like him. Then his tone shifted as he added that moreover, he wasn't in the position to be calling anyone despicable. He told Mujin that he would freak out if he found out why Li Cheng was headed to Luoyang. Mujin asked why that was. Li Chung put on his hat and started walking away, saying there was no need to know for now. He told Mujin to get Red Beggar ready, that they should depart. Mujin started looking around for Juson. He found Juson sitting down under the tree. Mujin grabbed their things and approached Juson, telling Red Beggar to hear that they should go. He asked why Juson was so down when he hadn't even been scratched. As Juson slowly got up, he responded solemnly that he lost, that Sir had to help him out, and that he needed to find an elixir for himself or something. As they started walking forward, Juson added that he couldn't just let Mujin catch up to him like this. Mujin responded as he chuckled that Juson said he was worthy of it, remember? Juson groaned and spoke toward Li Chung, asking if he knew of any places where they might find some elixir pills. Li Chung said of course he did, mentioning the place where the elixir of elixirs, the greater rejuvenation pill was. Juson shouted, asking where that was. Li Chung said, though, there's no chance that you'd be able to get the pill, Red Beggar, why don't we stop by that place, the Shaolin?